Everyone has their own ways of preparing for Doomsday. Some people would rather not think about it while the world burns down around them. Others have a spot reserved in one of the most luxurious Doomsday bunkers in the world. One family in a small New England town is stockpiling honeybees. And at the very top of the planet, in the frigid temperatures of the Arctic, a select few maintain a vault that could contain humanity's last hope for survival. Let's start with the best of the best, or at least the richest of the rich. What do the super rich get when they buy into the Oppidum complex in the Czech Republic? The answer is pretty much anything they want. The architects of the Oppidum have not only created a doomsday shelter, but a doomsday paradise. The complex sits in a quiet valley protected by natural features and a solid concrete wall. The walls are so high that the only way to see inside of the complex is by aerial view or entering through one of the secret entrances. The property itself is 323,000 square feet in size, but that doesn't even count most of the living space deep underground. There are plenty of things to do on the surface of the compound. But if the outside world is irradiated from nuclear war or a supervolcano blocks the sun for hundreds of years, the residents of Oppidum will spend most of their time in the 2 underground levels of this doomsday community. Each of these levels is 77,500 square feet with 13-foot-high ceilings. So how did the super rich prepare for their doomsday scenario? By adding all of the comforts they now enjoy to their secure underground community at Oppidum. To keep their clients comfortable and ensure they have everything they would ever need, Oppidum has added some key components at their underground facility. There's a garden that is grown using artificial lights, which are programmed to imitate the sun as closely as possible. Of course, they need to include a spa, a swimming pool, and a library. But no doomsday shelter for the super rich would be complete without installing a theater complex complete with every movie ever made. The underground compound will also contain the basics, such as a medical facility and all the necessary supplies to keep the community healthy. But it also includes custom vaults, so the residents can store their private art collections and any other valuables they don't want to lose during the end of the world. There will also be a full-service restaurant and a fully stocked wine cellar to keep everyone happy and drunk. The price tag for reserving a spot at Oppidum is not advertised, which means you'd have to contact them directly to find out. And if you have to ask the price, you probably can't afford it. Obviously, this is not how most people prep for Doomsday, but when you have a ton of money, you can go all out preparing for the end of the world. However, there are people who do some pretty insane things to prepare for Doomsday even if they don't have a huge budget. One former high school teacher in Ontario named Bruce Beach came up with an ingenious Doomsday plan using recycled school buses. He first started planning for Doomsday in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but even after we made it through the Cold War, he continued to build onto his Doomsday plan. Beach found the best way to utilize abandoned school buses from the school district he worked at was to repurpose them as a doomsday bunker. He would purchase them from the town and bury them underground. As Beach collected more and more buses, he connected them like Legos, forming a labyrinth of tunnels. In the 1980s, he finished his school bus shelter and named it Arc 2. The whole complex is made up of 42 school buses that are completely buried underground with a secure opening to enter the doomsday bunker. He was so proud of his accomplishment, he even rented out his school bus shelter to people to stay in, like an Airbnb. Arc 2 has a kitchen, a shower, and several bedrooms. One unique trait that Beach has that many doomsday preppers don't is generosity. He even has said that people have called him up just to ask if they had a space in Arc 2 for them if the world came to an end. He always responded that he did. This might be a uniquely Canadian trait, as it's very rare for someone to offer shelter to others in their doomsday shelter. One man in China is taking a different approach using the Arc name. Instead of reusing buses, he's taken a page out of the Bible. Lu Zhenghai has spent $160,000 on materials to build up a ship reminiscent of Noah's Ark, except a better name in this case might be Zhenghai's Ark. The reason he's spending so much money on the ship is to protect his family from the worldwide flood he sees coming. To be fair, sea levels are rising, and depending on where you live, there's a chance you could be flooded out of your home. This is especially true for island nations and coastal communities, but Zhenghai wants to make sure he and his family are prepared just in case the entire planet floods. He's building a ship around 65 feet long that weighs 80 tons. His materials of choice are steel and wood to construct the hull of the ship. The inside will then be split into different rooms and sections that will turn the boat into a comfortable house in which his family can live. Another man in China is preparing for the short-term impacts of Doomsday. He's doing this in a pretty crazy way by creating giant yellow balls. Yang Zhongfu has constructed several massive balls made out of steel that are 13 feet in diameter. Each one supposedly can withstand pretty much any type of disaster. He calls these spheres an Atlantis. They weigh around 3 tons and have been painted bright yellow. Zhang Fu claims the design is optimal for surviving sudden global catastrophes such as volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. The way the spheres are shaped allows them to float, roll, or even withstand the force of an explosion. One main problem with the Atlantis balls is that anyone inside would get tossed around. This led to Zhang Fu equipping each metal ball with seat belts. He even claims that the materials used would help someone survive a nuclear blast from a distance. If you were in the ball right next to where a nuclear device was detonated, the giant yellow ball would not save you. But if you were a little ways away, it could protect you from the shockwave as it rolled to safety. Zhang Fu has created a way to prepare for any disaster, but in a different way than many preppers have. His plan is to survive the initial cause of Doomsday and then leave his Atlantis structure to try to survive in a post-apocalyptic world. This is different from many Doomsday preppers, as he isn't in it for the long haul. He just wants to survive in the short term. Maybe his thought is that if the Atlantis balls couldn't save him from whatever Doomsday scenario ends the world, there wouldn't be much left in the apocalypse to look forward to anyway. It is insane how much time and money some people spend on a Doomsday plan. This couldn't be more true than one Australian man who's created his safe space high up in the mountains. In Australia, a man named Robert Bast has spent over $350,000 on survival equipment to make sure he's prepared for Doomsday. That is a crazy amount of money to spend on supplies if you're assuming the world is going to end, but most of what he stockpiles is expected, such as food, water, and gas. Unlike many other Doomsday preppers, Bast isn't building his shelter underground. Instead, he'll be traveling into the mountains for Armageddon. In fact, Bast has built a safe house 1,500 feet above sea level. He makes test runs periodically with his family to ensure they're ready in worst-case scenarios. Bast, his wife, and his kids pile into a pickup truck and speed up the mountain to where safety awaits. So it would seem that in the land down under, the Doomsday safe houses are not always down underground. Even more surprising than spending tons of money or living in a school bus is what some people collect to prepare for Doomsday. You wouldn't think that bees would be the animal of choice when preparing for the end of the world, but one New England woman disagrees. Kathy Harrison, also known as Doris Day of Doom, is stockpiling honeybees for the end of the world. She collects the bees with her husband and makes sure they're kept happy and healthy. The craziest part is what they plan to do with them when the world ends. When asked this question, Harrison tells people that bees are an excellent source of food. Their honey can be used to make all kinds of nutritious meals, not to mention in dire straits the bees themselves can be eaten as a small source of protein. The bees' wax can also be used as a preservative, which can keep vegetables and fruits fresher longer. But there's another, more unique use that the Harrisons have planned for their hives. When the world comes crashing down, they plan to use the bees and their honey as a commodity to barter with. Since money will have no value in a post-apocalyptic world, food and other important resources will be key. The bees can replenish their own numbers while simultaneously producing honey that can be bartered with. Basically, the Harrisons are using their bees as a cash cow. This will only work if the other people play nice after the world comes to an end. If New England turns into a Mad Max scenario, the bees will probably not be very useful. Some preppers around the world have created their Doomsday plan to include no one else but themselves and their immediate family. There will be no bartering and no communicating with others. This led one man to make the basement of his Las Vegas home his own private indoor world. This Doomsday prepper has recreated a quiet neighborhood right under his house. It comes with everything from an in-ground pool to a grassy lawn, and to be fair, the setup seems pretty relaxing, even if it is intended for the end of the world. The tiny houses in the bunker are just a single room, but they have lovely sliding glass doors, and inside is everything someone could need to ride out the apocalypse. Even if the housemates don't get along from time to time, they can escape each other by wandering through the small park and staring up at a fake sky. Honestly, if the world has to end, this might not be the worst place to spend the rest of your life. The only thing better than preparing for Doomsday with a small village in your basement is by making your entire house a bunker, and that is exactly what one architect did in Poland. This home is called the Safe House and is located just outside of Warsaw, Poland. It was created by Robert Konieczki of KWK Proms as an impenetrable fortress to protect whoever is inside from whatever Doomsday befalls the world, including a zombie apocalypse. The structure looks more like a giant concrete block than an actual house when it's in lockdown. It has no windows or doors and is completely isolated from the outside world. But when the coast is clear and Doomsday is over, the walls slide back, allowing anyone inside to have a beautiful view of the property. However, when the walls are open, the house is still protected by a solid concrete wall that lines the entire property. The cool thing is that if at any point the people inside the safe house feel unsafe, they can put the structure back in lockdown with the touch of a button. Inside is everything someone would want to keep them busy during the apocalypse. This might be the holy grail of Doomsday homes. If you thought the previous preppers were crazy, you haven't seen anything yet. A company called Vivos X Point has an insane plan for some open land in South Dakota. Vivos X Point doesn't plan to build just one bunker or even a few bunkers to prepare for the end of the world. Instead, Vivos X Point is building an entire underground city of 575 bunkers to house the last remaining survivors of Doomsday. There are entire towns with less than 575 structures, meaning this underground Doomsday city will be bigger than many other South Dakota communities. This will be a no-frills underground city providing only the necessities. However, they do build to suit their customers' needs. Vivos X Point has drawn up 4 different floor plans that a resident can choose from, so there is something for everyone. It would seem that the people in this region of the United States take Doomsday very seriously, and now they can be surrounded by like-minded individuals in Vivos X Point Underground City. Somewhere between a single hidden bunker and a full-blown city of Doomsday preppers, there is the Survival Condo. This behemoth underground structure looks like a reverse skyscraper. The building descends 201 feet into the earth and can house thousands of people when the end of the world comes. So this might be a good opportunity for many Doomsday preppers in the region to explore their options about post-apocalyptic living. The structure itself will be housed in a missile silo that was constructed during the Cold War. It will have 15 floors with all the amenities someone could hope for at the end of the world. The plan includes a dog walking area, a shooting range, and rock climbing walls. Of course, there will be indoor pools with a water park. There will also be restaurants and bars as well as medical facilities to care for everyone in the survival condo. The architects plan to create several redundant power storage systems and water filtration systems. The hydroponic system will grow plants using artificial lights to create a long-lasting supply of food. The plan is to be able to sustain the inhabitants of survival condo for 5 years without opening the hatch. This would be a much more bougie Doomsday setup than your average bunker. The structure won't be for everyone though. Doomsday preppers who have signed on for the project must share their underground condo complex with others. So it is not for preppers who are solely concerned about only saving themselves. On the plus side, the survival condo will be built deep enough and surrounded by the silo's protective covering, allowing it to survive a nuclear blast 100 times more powerful than the atomic bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. There is a less expensive option for Doomsday preppers in Indiana if they want to be surrounded by a small community of like-minded individuals but can't afford the expensive costs of an underground condominium. Vivos, Indiana is a communal Doomsday bunker that feels much more like a large office with some bedrooms than a luxurious bunker. It houses 80 people and is supposed to be able to sustain them for about a year. Everything is shared in this bunker, so it will be imperative everyone gets along. The bedrooms are separated, but the only thing that fits in them is a bed. The common room serves as the main areas of the complex, where meals are eaten and entertainment is enjoyed. What makes Vivos, Indiana different from other bunkers and Doomsday facilities is that everything is shared. Like other Doomsday communities, this could lead to problems, but the small size and lack of privacy in Vivos, Indiana could exacerbate those issues. This is just another example of the crazy ways people are planning to live out their remaining days after Doomsday. Everyone is different and everyone will want something different at the end of the world. Most people find planning for the apocalypse crazy and not worth doing since there's a decent chance they won't make it. For Doomsday preppers who want to live in a community but don't have the money to afford some of those uber expensive options, Vivos, Indiana might be a perfect fit. For those people who are constantly afraid of Doomsday happening even when they're on vacation, there's a special hotel just for them. The Felsen Hotel La Claustra is located inside of a mountain. That's right, for Doomsday preppers and adventurers alike, there's a hotel that is within a mountain. This is appealing for anyone who thinks Armageddon might be just around the corner. In the eyes of Doomsday prepper, Felsen Hotel La Claustra is a much safer option than a Four Seasons or Marriott during the end of the world. The structure used to be a Swiss military fortress built specifically to keep people safe inside it. However, this military base has been completely remodeled into a luxurious hotel with rock walls and comfy rooms. For people who want a vacation away from prepping but still want to be secure, they can sleep at Felsen Hotel La Claustra, eat in their main dining room located in a large cavern in the mountain, and walk around the property using subterranean tunnels. In the winter, the entrance is covered in snow, which is beautiful but also a reminder of how remote this hotel can be. Ideally, if the world was about to end and you were on vacation, this is where you'd want to be staying. Perhaps the most impressive and important Doomsday preppers of all are those who work at the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. This facility houses a backup supply of all the different plants that humans rely heavily on. This means that if all the crops were wiped out around the world by a global catastrophe, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault would be able to restart those food sources by using the seeds contained within their facility. This vital bunker is located at the furthest northern point that commercial airlines can fly, making it both remote and accessible. The vault itself is located 100 meters into the side of a mountain to ensure everything inside is secured. The environment in Svalbard also has a low humidity and is not anywhere near fault lines, which means it's safe from earthquakes. The entranceway and the vault are located well above sea level to help protect it from rising sea levels, and of course, being that far north means the region is incredibly cold. In fact, the permafrost located in the region creates a natural freezer to keep the seeds frozen for future use. Obviously, those seeds could only be used if the planet wasn't irradiated by nuclear fallout or completely flooded like in Noah's Ark story. But if a global catastrophe occurred and we needed to start from scratch, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault would have the tools to get our farming going again. When you think about it, Svalbard might not be the ideal location for every doomsday prepper, but it is perfect for storing the seeds for all the plants on the planet. A good indication of how crazy preppers can be is in an area found at the local survival surplus store. Owners of these outlets have heard and seen pretty much every insane doomsday prepper in their general vicinity. In Quebec, Canada, one survival store owner noticed that whenever there is political conflict, even if it's just during a divided election, people start to stack up on doomsday supplies. This isn't surprising, as it would only take one nation with nuclear capabilities to start an all-out war ending in a nuclear holocaust, but other events can trigger the insane tendencies of doomsday preppers even if it's nowhere near them. For example, when the Fukushima nuclear disaster occurred in Japan, people in Quebec started to prep for the end of the world. This is interesting because Quebec is very far away from Japan. However, the shop owner noticed that people almost immediately started buying anti-radiation pills, gas masks, and chemical protection suits after the news broke about the disaster. Loading up on all those things because a nuclear reactor melted down on the other side of the world seems extreme, but nothing could have been more normal to the Quebec doomsday preppers. Florida is a unique place. The beliefs of the people who live there can vary, but some are wildly different from the rest of the United States. That's why an interesting pattern emerges in the doomsday prepping community whenever a Democrat has a chance of getting elected. Survival store owners notice that when it isn't an election year and business seems to go on as usual, there aren't many strange purchases in the store, and customers tend to buy regular doomsday equipment like fire starters, water purifiers, and first aid supplies. But whenever there's a chance that a Democrat will become president, there's an increase in a rather unsettling commodity. Gun purchases increase drastically at Florida survival shops whenever an election cycle favors a Democratic candidate or if the race is close. This is surprising because regulars at survival stores who buy a lot of equipment tend to be doomsday preppers, not anti-government revolutionaries. Then again, sometimes those things can go hand in hand depending on where you are. One store owner noticed this crazy tendency and chalked it up to an odd idiosyncrasy in the region. For the most part, doomsday preppers in Florida seem to be similar to those in many other parts of the world. They buy a lot of supplies during hurricane season or if there's a conflict between major countries in the world. But for some reason, US politics is a driving force behind doomsday preppers loading up on firearms, which is not seen in many other regions. This is a slightly scary thought, as if you put together all the preppers and their firearms, they would have a decent-sized militia. Luckily, the world is still turning and there's a relative peace in the United States, but who knows what'll happen next election cycle if the Floridian preppers get angry. Surprisingly, Canadian doomsday preppers tend to be influenced by politics as well, except it isn't their own politics, but those of the US. Except in Canada, the doomsday preppers don't go out and buy a bunch of guns. Instead, they load up on food. There seems to be more fear of economic collapse by Canadian doomsday preppers than war during United States election cycles. Also, Canadians don't appear to be as interested in building concrete bunkers to ride out an apocalypse. Survival store owners admit that their customer base increases when things get tumultuous in the US or during a catastrophe somewhere else in the world. However, there's a very low demand for a fallout shelter buried deep underground compared to other parts of the world. Maybe this is because there is so much undeveloped land that it's super easy to just escape into the wilderness. Or perhaps Canadians just feel secluded cabins on the fringes of civilization work just as well as anything dug under the ground. In France, doomsday prepper stores sell slightly different supplies. This is because of the end-of-the-world fears are different than those in North America. Over the past 10 years, more and more Europeans are embracing the survivalist lifestyle. This is slightly different from doomsday prepping, but some see it as complementary. According to survival shop owners, politics tend to play less of a role in what preppers buy than fears around the damage done to our planet by pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. These fears influence what doomsday preppers buy in this part of the world. They focus on purchasing water purification systems and wilderness supplies over firearms. This is probably due to the fact that you can't shoot climate change or wage war against it using guns. This brings us to somewhat of a conundrum. People who take doomsday prepping seriously would not want to divulge their secrets. One of the key tenets of doomsday prepping is not telling people where your supplies are or how you plan to ride out the apocalypse. This is especially true if you have a hidden bunker somewhere filled with all those things you need to survive. So there are probably hundreds or even thousands of serious preppers that fly below the radar. Maybe they buy their supplies from different places, so they aren't seen as regular anywhere. Or maybe they have other people they trust to buy them supplies. One thing is for sure though, true professional preppers are not broadcasting their location or doing interviews about their end-of-the-world plan if they're trying to outlast everyone else. We need to get the people off the rig. We may not be able to hold the rig. The rig might be going over. The foreman's desperate cry crackled over the emergency radio, his voice barely audible over the deafening storm. The Ocean Ranger, once a towering fortress in the sea, was under siege. Huge waves crashed against it from all sides as frigid water poured in. In the chaos, the men fought for life jackets, their only hope for survival, as others made a more desperate choice, leaping from the gigantic oil rig into the ocean below. Those left aboard watched and were faced with a terrifying reality. Would they soon be meeting the same fate? Only a few hours earlier, the Ocean Ranger had been standing upright in the sea. Now the gigantic oil rig was leaning dangerously far over, tilting closer and closer to the roaring waves, as if the ocean itself was determined to pull the enormous vessel under the inky black surface. How did it all go so wrong? How did this unstoppable force of engineering become a death trap? And with time running out, could anyone survive the rig's final moments? They thought it was unsinkable. Even though the crew aboard all called it a rig, the Ocean Ranger was technically a self-propelled drilling platform designed to be semi-submersible. At the time, it was by far the largest platform of its kind ever built, weighing 25,000 tons, or 28,000 short tons, and standing at roughly the height of a 33-story building. While it towered over the crew aboard the main deck, almost an entire third of the Ocean Ranger itself was concealed deep beneath the water. 80 feet below the waves were a pair of 400-foot pontoons, equipped with ballast tanks that could be filled with water to keep the rig afloat in harsh seas. In theory, it should have been able to take whatever the ocean threw at it, unsinkable, or so they thought. They were drilling in the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, 166 miles or 267 kilometers away from the Canadian mainland. The rig was burrowing 1,500 feet deep into the oil and natural gas reserves below the ocean floor. It was in an area known for dangerous weather, particularly in the winter months. The crew aboard the Ocean Ranger had trusted that the rig would be enough to protect them from the sheer force of the sea. But that trust would offer them little protection against the combined forces of the elements, like opening an umbrella to fend off a hurricane. February 14, 1982. That morning, the crew listened to the weather forecasts, the reporters warning that a harsh winter storm with winds of 90 knots and waves of up to 37 feet was rolling toward the Grand Banks, thanks to a large cyclone further out in the Atlantic. But none of them worried all that much. The rig was designed to withstand those weather conditions, so nobody saw any immediate cause for concern. Most of the crew had even seen it standing firm against powerful waves and storms before. The harsh winter weather conditions near the Grand Banks hadn't been understated to the crew of hardened oilmen. But still, not one of them aboard had any reason to believe that this next storm would be any different than the last. After all, why would it? Famous last words. The crew still had to prepare the rig and everyone aboard for the incoming storm. Some were responsible for finding any equipment that was likely to be carried overboard by the fearsome winds and securing it in place. Others were tasked with meticulously checking that weather-tight portholes and doors were properly sealed. Then, most critical of all was the need to manage the ballast tanks below. The ballast control system mediated the amount of seawater going into or out of the tanks, meaning they could maintain the Ocean Ranger's buoyancy in response to the wild, unruly waters below. If that failed, they were all as good as dead. But the crew knows that the Ranger is a sturdy beast. It's designed to withstand 110-foot tall waves and wind speeds of up to 100 knots. Despite how intense this incoming storm was reported to be, it does little to deter the crew from going about their day-to-day duties after the appropriate safety measures have been taken. But they wouldn't be nearly enough in the face of the storm that was approaching. Little did any of the crew know, the storm would bring waves that would decimate all of the Ocean Ranger's defenses. Whether driven by their belief that the Ocean Ranger could withstand the weather, or out of fear of reprisals from their superiors at Odeco Inc. and Mobil if they abandoned their station, the crew persevered. As the long stormy night rolled on, conditions in the rig made it harder to work. The rain was bad enough, working in tandem with the fierce winds of 80 knots or 92 miles per hour to freeze the men to the bone. It was dark out at sea, even with the lights aboard the Ranger. Visibility was poor. Drilling quickly became an uphill battle. The rig's systems required constant monitoring, most crucially the ballast control system, and the crew was spread dangerously thin. Before long, the waves battering the Ocean Ranger began to climb, increasing in height and gradually pushing the limits of what the rig could withstand. The crew was in constant radio communication with the shore, as well as other rigs in the area too, keeping them all up to speed on the situation out at sea while the drilling continued. 7:15 p.m. A radio transmission reached the Sedco 706. The crew aboard the neighboring oil platform overheard some internal communications from the Ocean Ranger, reporting that the waves were getting bigger, with some being between 55 and 65 feet. There was also something about a broken porthole and water seeping into the rig itself. Only moments before, a rogue wave had come rolling toward the Ocean Ranger, one far larger and stronger than the others in the storm. The oil rig had already been pushed to its limits, bombarded by increasingly powerful waves, and this was the one that hit it the hardest. The wave directly struck the side of the Ocean Ranger with such force that it shattered one of the porthole windows, one that just so happened to be in the ballast control room. A huge rush of icy water surged into one of the most essential rooms of the entire rig, home to the system that was vital for keeping the Ocean Ranger stable. Each subsequent wave that hit the rig now had a way in. The impending flood quickly destroyed the tech in the ballast control room. The porthole wasn't a large opening, but it was big enough for seawater to gush inside with each big wave. The porthole itself was only 25 feet from the ocean surface. Any wave higher than that was bringing more and more water aboard. 9 p.m. The radio operator aboard the nearby Sedco oil platform overheard another transmission from the Ocean Ranger. Their crew says there's something seriously wrong with their rig's ballast control valves. They now seem to be opening and closing of their own accord. Back on the Ocean Ranger, the furious waters and now inoperable ballast tanks below caused the whole rig to list and tilt violently beneath the crew's feet. There was one hope, a way to manually control the ballast tanks. But the storm was only getting worse. Beneath the ocean surface, more water floods the forward chain lockers, located in the front-facing support columns for the rig. Thanks to the broken porthole in the ballast control room and the Ocean Ranger tilting forward, the forward chain lockers let in enough water that the corner support columns began to flood. The seawater levels inside the rig began to climb, eventually spilling out onto the upper deck. Splashes underfoot become ankle-deep. Then they rose to the knee, crewmen needing to wade through rising water. The moment that the flooding spread to the oil platform, it looked like the vessel would capsize, plunging everyone on board under the icy depths of the storm-frenzied sea. Meanwhile, the crew inside the ballast control room were still battling the elements while trying to stabilize the Ocean Ranger. But water wasn't the only problem. Not one of them had been trained properly. There had been a startling lack of crew training for those aboard the Ocean Ranger. The crew had no idea how to operate the ballast control system, even without the added panic of the storm and the water disrupting the system. While trying to fix the problem, the crew aboard the Ocean Ranger had accidentally increased the forward list of the rig, making the situation far, far worse. 12:52 a.m. The early hours of February 15, 1982. The Ocean Ranger broadcast a mayday, reporting that their platform was listing badly. An emergency vessel standing by, the MV Seaforth Highlander, sailed out to assist. Within 10 minutes of the alarming message hitting the airwaves, helicopters owned by Mobil and the Canadian Coast Guard were in the air, heading toward the rig. Hospitals in St. John's on the mainland were told to be on standby. Out at sea, despite help being on the way, the bow of the Ocean Ranger continued to dip lower, while at the same time, the stern of the rig was raised up out of the water. The ballast control system was located in the stern, meaning that those inside were losing their footing and risking serious injury as the room around them started to tilt. To make matters worse, the pumps used to fill the ballast tanks with water didn't have sufficient power to send the water up such a steep incline now that the stern was rising out of the water. Each hour, the list of the Ocean Ranger got worse, looking more and more like the crew were either going to need to abandon the rig or die aboard it. So the call was made and emergency procedures were quickly underway. All drilling operations had already been halted, but it was now time to start seriously considering a full-scale evacuation of the Ocean Ranger. Crew members raced up and down the lengths of the listing rig to shut down any systems that weren't deemed essential. Everyone had to turn their focus toward crisis management. But as if the severity of the storm, malfunctioning equipment, and the increasing tilt of the platform weren't enough to contend with, Just like when it came to regaining control of the ballast system, the company hadn't provided the crew with formal training in the safety procedures for the Ocean Ranger, including evacuation procedures. They were on their own, working off what experience they had with emergencies like this, which was limited at best, and not helped by the safety features aboard the Ocean Ranger being inadequate as well. The standby vessels on their way to help had also been given no safety protocols to follow, which would mean they'd be unable to rescue any crew members that successfully evacuated aboard lifeboats. The Canadian Coast Guard, on their way to aid the crew of the Ocean Ranger, exercised their right to sequester other boats to assist in an emergency, enlisting the support of the MV Boltentor and MV Norditor. These were standby vessels for the Sedco 706 and another nearby platform, Zapata Ugland, respectively. However, those boats, along with the MV Seaforth Highlander, had to fight against the same elements that were battering the Ocean Ranger. The high winds and turbulent waters were prohibiting safe approach for the boats, making it just as big of a risk to the lives of the rescue teams as the crew they were sailing out to assist. Still, while the crew aboard were trying desperately to find an exit strategy, the support vessels were braving the violent stormy waters. They had every intention of reaching the unstable platform and evacuating the crew on board. But the harsh conditions were making it all the more challenging. But the ongoing storm wasn't the only factor hindering the rescue attempts. The standby vessels were still woefully ill-equipped for the task and hadn't been properly configured to rescue Ocean Ranger crew members if they managed to make their way off the rig and into the icy seas below. 1:30 a.m. The final message from the Ocean Ranger was transmitted. There will be no further radio communications from Ocean Ranger. Comes the foreboding broadcast from the radio operator. We are going to lifeboat stations. Afterward, the support vessels could hear nothing. The other platforms listening in for radio chatter only received static. The Ocean Ranger had gone silent. Aboard the rig, the crew was in the midst of an evacuation attempt. It wasn't as simple as hopping into a lifeboat and sailing to the safety of the shore. It was a frenzy, scores of people clamoring to get off the sinking rig. Many were either trying to barge their way to being aboard one of the first lifeboats or were desperately gathering up any essential survival gear they could carry. Some were putting the rest of the crew before themselves and ensuring that the life jackets had been passed out among the men, fastening and securing them ready to go. Others were trying desperately to ready the lifeboats for departure, as the Ocean Ranger listed and tilted more and more around them. Almost as horrifying as the rig tilting all around them was the knowledge among some crew that even if they made it off the Ocean Ranger, there was a reason that evacuation was a last resort. A lifeboat was not a ticket to safety. It was just an exchange, swapping a huge vessel that had already been ravaged by the sea for a tiny one that could just as easily be swept away by the waves. Even getting free from the Ocean Ranger, the crewmen still would be at the mercy of the elements, thrown about on the water, while huddled together in the hopes that one of the rescue teams would both see them and be able to reach them in the storm. While some crew tried desperately to prepare for evacuation with little preparation or training to equip them for an emergency like this, others were starting to panic. Tensions were climbing. Some of the men were still confused as to what had happened, while others were anxious to abandon the Ocean Ranger before the rig became their watery tomb. But not one of them was ignorant of the terrifying, inescapable truth. All of their lives were at stake. The lifeboats aboard the Ocean Ranger, like many, were designed to launch in adverse and extreme conditions, but not many are intended to launch at the angle the oil platform was now listing. In particular, the lifeboats aboard the Ocean Ranger relied on gravity to drop directly down into the water, meaning the rig needed to be relatively level, which it certainly was not anymore. But in a minor miracle, one of the lifeboats was able to successfully launch, containing up to 36 members of the crew, all jammed inside the tiny vessel. Sometime after the lifeboat had hit the water, the MV Seaforth Highlander support boat arrived in the area, only to see bodies floating in the water. There were 20 crew members at least floating in the choppy seas, according to the later reports by witnesses aboard the standby vessel. Combined with the others aboard the lifeboat, that made a total of 56 who had made it to the water one way or another. 2:21 a.m. The MV Seaforth Highlander spotted emergency flares and began moving toward one of the lifeboats. It drifted toward the standby vessel, containing a handful of the Ocean Ranger's crew members. As it pulled up alongside them, the rescue team aboard the Seaforth was able to hurriedly throw lines to the lifeboat and started to pull it closer through the ocean. But the storm was still swirling the waters into a maelstrom, and before anyone could be helped out of the lifeboat and brought aboard the Seaforth Highlander, the small vessel was hammered hard against the hull of the support vessel. More heavy waves caused the line to suddenly snap and overturn the lifeboat. It capsized in the freezing North Atlantic waters, leaving the few men clambering out of the lifeboat now clinging to its sides for dear life, soaked and chilled to the bone, their hands numb from the icy water. The MV Seaforth Highlander fought through the swelling waves to reach the men, but it was already too late. By the time the boat reached them, the cold had already taken them. Only one of the Ocean Ranger crew was seen in a bright orange life jacket. The Seaforth Highlander almost chopped him to pieces with its propellers as it tried moving into position to save him. The rescue crew aboard hurled a grappling hook into the water, attempting to pull the man aboard. Even though it hooked onto his life jacket, the man soon slipped out of sight beneath the water. Desperately trying to save anyone from the Ocean Ranger, the rescue team aboard the Seaforth realized they couldn't pull someone from waters as violent as these, the towering waves making it dangerous to attempt to save any of the men drowning or freezing to death. As if battling with the tall icy waves and powerful winds whipped up by the storm wasn't hard enough, the standby vessels just hadn't been equipped for an emergency of this scale. 2:30 a.m. The Coast Guard and mobile-owned rescue helicopters had arrived. Much like the standby vessels, they struggled to approach, thanks to the severity of the storm. One made its way to hover over the first man that the crew spotted and lowered a rescuer down to pluck the Ocean Ranger crewman from the sea, but he was already dead. The choppers battled against the wind speeds of 90 miles per hour, but even with the struggle to stay airborne in those conditions, the thrashing of the sea made it nearly impossible to recover bodies from the waters below. Instead, the best that the helicopters could do was try to guide the support ships toward the bodies that were floating through the ocean. But trying to get closer, it was clear to the crews aboard the Seaforth Highlander and the other sequestered boats that they were putting themselves in harm's way. The men out on the deck trying to recover the bodies risked being knocked overboard themselves by the freezing cold waves, potentially joining the Ocean Ranger's crew in their grim fate. 2:45 a.m. Another of the rescue teams reported that they could see the Ocean Ranger. The platform was still listing heavily, waves crashing over onto the main deck, which should have been standing high above the sea level. From a distance, there didn't look to be anyone left on board, and all the lifeboats were gone. They could have been swept up by the storm, or perhaps the remaining crew had managed to launch them. Continuing to search the waters, the standby vessels and the helicopters working in tandem could find 2 more of the lifeboats and a handful of the inflatable life rafts from the Ocean Ranger. Each one had no one on board. One of the boats found one lifeboat that was carrying the bodies of several more crew members inside, but the rescue crew were unable to recover it, thanks to the storm. That lifeboat was never seen again. By the time the rescue helicopters had arrived, it was already too late. They could do little more than provide a futile gesture of assisting the boats below, but they were having just as hard of a time navigating through the stormy weather. Each and every member of the Ocean Ranger's crew was dead. Those who made it off the rig had either succumbed to hypothermia or drowned, and those who didn't, if they had survived aboard the capsizing platform, likely didn't live for very much longer. The Ocean Ranger was listing so severely that it was no longer stable. 3:13 a.m. The Ocean Ranger oil rig capsized completely and disappeared beneath the waterline, gone from sight and plummeting down to the bottom of the ocean. The disaster was finally over, and no one had survived. Despite the numerous attempts by standby vessels and helicopters to rescue crewmen from the water, not one succeeded. The wave that started it all by crashing through the Ocean Ranger's porthole and damaging the ballast control system had taken 84 lives, every single member of the crew. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the search and rescue operation had now become a recovery mission. Over the next few days, of the 84 crew members on board, only 22 of the bodies were recovered from the North Atlantic Ocean and brought to Pier 17 Harbor. A few days later, debris from the Ocean Ranger and the crew's personal effects washed up on the shores of Newfoundland. Once the storm out in the North Atlantic had subsided, the combined forces of the Canadian military and the United States Coast Guard conducted an extensive search for whatever was still left of the Ocean Ranger. Over several weeks after the sinking, they used sonar to sweep the surrounding area of the ocean the platform had gone down in. The wreckage was eventually found almost 500 feet to the southeast of the wellhead it had been operating in before the storm hit. The main structure of the Ocean Ranger lay 260 feet below the water on the ocean floor, surrounded by its own debris, everything that had been broken off during the storm. including the oil rig's derrick and the cranes on board, now lay strewn about like bones on the seabed. Determining that the ruins of the Ocean Ranger were resting shallow enough to be a hazard to marine life and seafaring vessels alike, the sunken wreckage was floated and towed toward deeper waters, where it was allowed to sink once more. Just another watery grave. The ocean is home to some of the most frightening monsters known to mankind, but it looks like it might be home to the biggest mystery of them all, UFOs. The topic of UFOs might have left us scratching our heads previously, but the data coming out of the US Navy in recent years has left us rubbing our eyes in astonishment instead. Consider Exhibit A, the motherlode of evidence provided by Timothy Gallaudet, former chief oceanographer of the US Navy, a retired rear admiral no less, citing the 2019 brush with an unidentified foreign object hovering over a US battleship before abruptly plunging into the ocean. The episode raised a number of new questions given voice by the rear admiral and revised many misconceptions. First of all, it looked like the unidentified flying objects, or UFOs, and unidentified submersible objects, or USOs, are linked. In a recent paper titled "Beneath the Surface, We May Learn More About UAP by Looking in the Ocean," Gallaudet reached the fantastical conclusion that unidentified foreign objects are actually transmedium. Unidentified submersible objects, or what the Pentagon likes to call unidentified aerial phenomenon, and they have the capacity to fly in the air and swim in the ocean like submarines. He wrapped up the paper with the alarming conclusion that these transmedium vehicles could seriously jeopardize U.S. maritime security. Though extraordinary, the conclusions have left security analysts wondering with unease if they've been scanning the skies for clear and present danger while it's been hiding in the deep oceans all along. Is there any substance to Gallaudet's concerns, or are these just outlandish musings? Conclusions can only be based on facts, so let's see what the data is telling us. According to a Pew Research Center survey held in 2022, 65% of Americans believe in life beyond the Earth and in UFOs, and a 51% majority sincerely believe that the government's investigation into UAPs is further proof of aliens. There are a few incidents like the ones we'll describe that provide irrefutable evidence that unidentified submersible objects are a reality, with a few standing out in the crowd. USO has become the latest buzzword, and it's all due to the 18 months Gallaudet spent investigating such incidents, interviewing dozens of sailors, submariners, military personnel, and members of the U.S. Coast Guard, all of whom have seen suspicious activity around the ocean, and then publishing his findings. Gossip was going around the naval grapevine of something happening in July 2019 and the months after to a fleet of Navy warships sailing along the Southern California coastline. The story took another year to break when documentary filmmaker Jeremy Corbell released videos of the episodes online, which the Pentagon later verified. It was confirmed that several sailors were on board the battleships and saw them being swarmed by several UFOs. There was video footage taken by the sailors, which showed flashing objects hovering above the warships. Included was raw video footage of radar showing 9 blobs on the screens and infrared footage of one orb-shaped object diving into the ocean. The video evidence is so spectacular that the Pentagon could not deny it, and its authenticity was confirmed by the highest government agencies. This couldn't have happened by chance, as it went on for several hours and was followed by similar occurrences repeating throughout the following months. Corbell confirmed that the sailors who saw everything swore that the swarm was no small thing, as it was composed of at least 100 UFOs capable of feats far beyond that of traditional drones, since they were able to surround multiple warships at the same time. This didn't happen once, but it was a series of events happening over different warships at different times. So many sailors witnessed the incidents that it couldn't be ignored. So what happened that it's upended the official narrative completely? Let's take a look. It started with what happened on March 30th, 2019, when a whopping 8 unknown objects were spotted by the sailors of the USS Harper's Ferry flying at an altitude of 500 feet. This was followed by another event on April 24th, 2019, this time involving the USS Zumwalt, which identified 6 drones flying overhead in the same area. The same thing happened on July 15th, 2019, when the USS Paul Hamilton is alleged to have been followed by drones for 4 hours. The USS Bunker Hill reported being followed by 11 objects. Meanwhile, the USS Ralph Johnson reported 14 drones surrounding it. On the same night, the USS Omaha was surrounded by 9 objects on the radar. Footage of a radar screen detecting a swarm over the ship shows 9 objects moving up to 138 knots, which is more than 158 miles per hour, with winds of 31 knots. But what happened next is the pinnacle of Timothy Gallaudet's argument. One object seemed to hover over the ship's side before shooting directly downwards into the ocean, and it disappeared with a splash. The video footage showing the radar screen also recorded the comments of the sailors in the background, saying they heard a splash as it hit the water. Another event occurred on July 17, 2019, when the USS Russell observed 3 objects flying over it for an hour. On July 21, 2019, USS Paul Hamilton again spotted drones ahead. On July 25, 2019, USS Gabriel Giffords observed 4 drones overhead and proceeded to request help from the nearby USS Pinckney. This was followed by another incident on July 30, 2019, when sailors aboard USS Russell witnessed 2 groups of lights overhead for a period of about 3 hours. At the same time, USS Paul Hamilton reported that multiple drones were overhead, some of which were only 200 yards from it. It should be noted that the personnel used the word drones in need of a better word. Out of all these incidents, the Omaha incident has become the gold standard for UFO aficionados for some pretty striking and undeniable observation. It's given birth to the term unidentified submersible objects, which was coined after a flying object flew straight into the ocean. The idea that such technology exists on Earth, which is beyond the comprehension and capability of the defense forces, is a nightmare. Were these contact attempts? And why was there such an intense barrage of it in a couple of months together? Were these reconnaissance missions, and Gallaudet's alarm is well placed? We'll come back to that question later, but first, let's look at how common such sightings are. Such stories are not new to U.S. airmen and sailors. Now, a little about the agencies already keeping track of these incidents. Between 1947 and 1969, at the height of the Cold War, Project Blue Book was put together by a top-secret Air Force team to keep an eye on these incidents. It recorded reports of more than 12,000 UFO sightings. A couple of decades later, the National UFO Reporting Center, or NUFORC, was established in the United States to document such incidents, and its reports show that such incident reports are climbing. Though there were 2 dips noted in 2018 and 2021, by 2022 things have changed, which ended with more than 5,000 alleged UFO sightings. Reports peaked at 8,800 in 2014 and 7,400 in 2020. Then, news of the naval incidents broke and interest peaked once again. In 2022, surveys conducted showed that 17% of Americans said they thought it was likely that aliens will visit the Earth, just a little behind the global 18%. The responses recorded in India, China, and Latin America showed an even higher score for likelihood. By May 2023, close to 1,400 sightings have been recorded. All in all, more than 80,000 UFO sightings have been noted by NUFORC. So, what's the significance of the incidents of 2019, and why is so much noise being made? So it seems we've been getting visits from our buddies in the sky for a long time. But the equation has changed with the documented incidents reported by the seamen. These incidents have created such pressure that the cat has finally escaped the bag. The ramifications of such incidents are too serious to ignore. And finally, government officials are answering questions. In a May 2022 hearing in front of a panel of House representatives, top Pentagon officials confessed that they have a record of over 400 reports from military personnel of possible encounters with unidentified foreign objects, which is a reversal of the 144 figure mentioned in a major report released by the U.S. intelligence community before that. The report, released on June 25, 2022, was a watershed event with a certified government agency coming out straight and accepting that these incidents are real, not just stories. The 9-page report, released to Congress and the public, detailed 144 observations of such objects by U.S. Navy personnel dating back to 2004. Though now there is undisputed acceptance that such incidents are real, the only dispute is over what these objects are. Such a ruckus has been created over these reports that the U.S. Department of Defense finally directed the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, to investigate the incidents. In June 2021, the government released a 9-page report outlining the results of the investigation into the incidents that had been reported dating back to 2004. It outlined a series of questions related to the unidentified aerial phenomenon. Are these advanced earthly technologies or atmospherics or objects of an extraterrestrial origin. The report also insists that these unidentified objects were actually, quote, drones, which raises more questions rather than answering them. The crewmen logged the objects as drones because they had to respond quickly, and the system only allowed them to record the incident report. This has played into the official verdict as Navy chiefs represented by the Deputy Director for Naval Intelligence, Scott Breyer, dismissed the evidence, saying he was reasonably confident that the objects were drones. But according to naval records made public due to the Freedom of Information Act or FOIA, the capabilities showcased by these drones, like hovering at altitudes of up to 21,000 feet, flying for more than 4 hours, traveling long distances in a single flight, and being invulnerable to anti-drone Navy technology. If these were drones, they weren't like any drones known to humans. And where did they come from? Well, that's easy, as the same report also concluded that the drones were quadcopter-style unmanned aerial systems, or UASs, and most likely flew from a Hong Kong-registered freight ship, Bass Strait, docked nearby. The super suspicious ship was innocently docked in Long Beach, California, only 100 miles from all the action, but according to the report, its activities were nefarious. These arguments lack a leg to stand on and have been received with a lot of scorn by UFO connoisseurs. But the question remains, what sort of quadcopters can dive underwater? Hold that thought. Consider this. More than 80% of the ocean remains unexplored. It's all down to physics. Exploring the ocean is as difficult as exploring the universe, but more difficult in some ways. Once deep enough, visibility becomes zero. The temperature is extremely cold, and pressure is strong enough to crush an entire vessel. To put it simply, at sea level, our bodies experience 15 pounds of pressure per square inch. Going up into space is easier, as the higher you go, the less pressure there is until it reaches zero. But if you went deep diving, the same pressure would stack up the further you went down until splat. Take the Mariana Trench, for example, which is just 7 miles deep. The pressure would be 1,000 times more than on the surface. So the ocean remains one of the greatest mysteries right on our doorstep, and it's the best place for an enemy to hide. So the concern is well deserved. But how are security strategists taking it? Unfortunately, the investigations held into these occurrences have fallen far short of the mark on many counts. The argument that these were just quadcopters being used to spy on U.S. Navy battleships does not ring true and is taken as a joke. However, for Gallaudet and others who agree with him, these occurrences need to be taken seriously, since they have such serious implications for U.S. security. Imagine our troops fighting against an enemy with such a technological edge over our forces. A battle with an enemy capable of such advanced vehicles would be devastating, and that's the point under discussion. There's a definite lack of research and the data on this phenomenon, which has been relegated to a box labeled cuckoo. We might have a long way to go before these questions are handled with a modicum of seriousness. However, a gradual change is coming in how such questions are now received. But there might be a silver lining to this cloud, named Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. Newly appointed to the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, he's brought a breath of fresh air to an otherwise stale atmosphere in the offices. He's also promised to follow the data wherever it takes him, which might just be to outer space or the ocean floor. At least Congress is looking at this matter with gravity and established the office recently to coordinate efforts across federal agencies to detect, identify, and attribute mysterious objects of interest in the air, in outer space, and underwater, with a special focus on mitigating potential threats to military operations and national security. So the government has finally sat up and taken notice. Not a moment too soon, as technology has reached just the right stage where the development of AI can help in making the necessary technological advances that could help us explore our oceans and deal with any threats coming from across the borders, outer space, or even from within our oceans. All we need is the will. So, you want to be a time traveler? You think you got what it takes? Sure, you're a history buff with a sense of adventure. You've watched enough sci-fi movies to know not to step on any random bugs or teach a medieval peasant about iPhones and Doritos, but there's more to traveling through time than just that. For instance, you need to be prepared to avoid one of the greatest inconveniences a time traveler can face: accidentally breaking the law. A time machine won't do you much good if you wind up behind bars with no way to get back to it. Depending on the time and the place that you've traveled to, you could even wind up executed. Good luck getting back to the present after your head's been separated from the rest of your body. Luckily for you, you found this video, so whether you're a seasoned time traveler looking for an information refresh, or an aspiring traveler preparing for your first voyage, or just some random legal history enthusiast, you've come to the right place. This is your guide to the insane things that at various points in history used to be illegal. You probably think about the Roman Empire a lot, don't you? Well, even if you don't, you're definitely thinking about it now. Maybe you want that to be your next stop, to throw on a toga and see Caesar invent that famous salad. What's that? He didn't invent the salad? Then why is it called that? Never mind, not important. We're talking about laws. First and foremost, let's talk about what not to wear. If you're headed to ancient Rome, stay away from purple fabrics. Are you an emperor? No? Then it's a crime for you to wear purple in ancient Rome. Due to the expensive nature of purple dye during the days of the Roman Empire, such extravagant garb was reserved only for the wealthiest and most powerful. It doesn't matter if it's your signature color or if it really brings out your eyes. Non-royalty in ancient Rome had to skip the purple if they didn't want to wind up on the wrong side of the justice system. Female time travelers, take note: if you find yourself attending a funeral in ancient Rome, make sure you do not cry. Women crying at funerals was outlawed in ancient Rome. Why would they pass such a seemingly cruel law? Well, to combat the burgeoning funeral actor industry, of course. Ancient Roman funerals would begin with a procession of mourners walking down the street and weeping. The more people in the procession, the more beloved and popular the deceased was assumed to be. In response, a new job opportunity popped up for enterprising women: professional mourners, walking in the procession and weeping, tearing at their hair, generally making a scene over people they didn't even know. In order to crack down on that development, women were legally barred from crying at funerals to discourage people from hiring actors. Now imagine this: you're walking through the streets of ancient Rome, enjoying the breeze in your new, definitely not purple toga, when you notice a storm rolling in. Uh-oh, the air takes on a crackling electrical feel and you know lightning is about to strike. Sure enough, a flash of light blinds you for a moment as a bolt of lightning strikes a man only a few feet from you, killing him instantly. Oh no, that poor guy. Better get him a proper burial. It's only right. Wrong. Under the law of Numa Pompilius, no one struck by lightning is legally allowed to be buried. You see, this wasn't just a freak accident in the minds of ancient Romans. This was a personal screw you from Jupiter, the god of thunder himself. Defying the gods is a pretty severe no-no, and if you bury that body, it's as good as stealing a sacrifice from Jupiter. Bury the body anyway, and someone would find themselves sacrificed in its place. They can move the body out of the road if it were a trip hazard or something, but only if they didn't lift it above their knees, because that was a crime too. So now that you're better prepared for any trips to ancient Rome, let's move on to another exciting time and place: Imperial China. Most of the advice for this region and era boils down to be neat, clean, and respectful, and failure to do so might get you into some real legal trouble. During the Shang Dynasty in 1600 to 1046 BCE, glittering was strictly prohibited. We're not talking about a fine or even just a little jail time. Laws during this time period stated that anyone caught throwing garbage on the road would be strictly punished by having their hand cut off. Anyone going fishing during the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 907 needed to be extra careful because the word for carp had the same pronunciation in Chinese as the last name of the Tang emperors. Extra respect was paid to the fish. According to the Miscellany of Yu Yang, a collection of records concerning legends and folk customs from the time, anyone who caught a carp while fishing was expected to release the fish right away and definitely could not eat them. Anyone caught selling carp would be flogged 60 times. So, time traveler, if you're going to go fishing in the Tang Dynasty, get very, very good at identifying fish first. Or you could just go to the Yuan Dynasty, 1206 to 1368 instead, where all fish were fair game. Don't mess with chickens though. According to the Yuan Dynasty historian Yang Yu, during the reign of Emperor Renzog, people in the capital were forbidden from holding chickens upside down. Anyone who defied this extremely specific law would be convicted of a crime and likely jailed. This is likely due to the fact that the emperor's zodiac sign was that of a rooster. To be safe, just treat all birds and fish with respect during your travels. Speaking of respecting animals, if you should find yourself traveling to ancient Egypt, there is one particular animal you need to make sure you treat with the utmost reverence: the cat. Cats were sacred in ancient Egypt, and harming one could earn you a punishment as harsh as the death penalty. which honestly, given how cute cats are, seems pretty fair. Let's just get a bit more recent and time travel over to jolly old England for a spell. It's time to get medieval. So, you want to travel to England during the Middle Ages, live out your own personal Knight's Tale. Nothing wrong with that, but there are a few things to keep in mind. Step out of your line in the wrong place at the wrong time, break the wrong obscure law, and it's off with your head. When you get to medieval England, you need to find food, of course, but be careful. Don't go hunting for game all willy-nilly. In 1198, a law was passed outlawing any hunting of deer in the royal forest. If you were caught hunting venison there, you faced quite a harsh punishment: blinding and castration. Makes you lose your appetite, doesn't it? The law was repealed in 1217, thankfully, but it's still probably best to stay away from the royal deer. Maybe it's best to avoid meat altogether and just stick to bread and ale. Just be careful if you decide to sell bread or ale in medieval England, though. In 1266, a statute was issued that fixed the prices of bread and ale in order to eliminate competition between those selling them. Bread was expected to be sold at a certain weight in correlation with the price of wheat, and a baker caught selling underweight bread would be fined and pilloried for violating the law. Oh, and speaking of food, don't think you'll be eating any grand six-course meals. From 1336 to 1856, a law proclaimed by Edward III was on the books, stating that no man, of whatever rank he be, could be served a meal with more than 2 courses. There were some exceptions for special occasions such as Christmas, which allowed for 3, but otherwise that cap was strictly set at 2. Food wasn't the only legal minefield in medieval England. Remember that whole bit about not wearing purple in ancient Rome? There were laws restricting fashion choices in medieval England as well. Many of these laws were put in place to prevent people from dressing like a higher status than they were, and others were intended to protect public decency. In 1463, a law was passed ordering that no person under the rank of lord is to wear any gown, jacket, or coat which does not cover the genitals and the buttocks. Break that rule and they'd wind up paying a 20-shilling fine. These fashion laws didn't just cover the lack of coverage that was getting popular in medieval men's fashion. For 15th century gentlemen, pikes, or shoes with long pointed ends, were all the rage. They weren't exactly big on restraint or minimalism, so sometimes these ends were long enough that they needed to be tied back around the ankles of the man wearing them. So these shoes were included in that same 1463 statute. The new shoe-based edict declared that no knight under the rank of a lord, esquire, or gentleman, nor any other person, shall wear any shoes or boots having spikes or points which exceed the length of 2 inches. Break this law and a fashion victim would be fined 3 shillings and 4 pence. These laws didn't just cover what people could wear and eat, but what they did in the privacy of their own bedrooms. Throughout the medieval era, the church held a great deal of power and exercised that power in a variety of ways. One of them was by telling married couples which days they were allowed to have sex on and which were strictly prohibited. Sex was forbidden on Thursdays and Fridays, which were set aside as preparation days for the Holy Communion, as well as on Sundays. Sex was also prohibited during Lent, during the days before Christmas, and the days surrounding the Feast of the Pentecost. So, if that's off the table, what else is there to do during leisure time around here? Maybe you could play some sports. Just choose your sports wisely because some of them were outlawed during the Middle Ages. Football, or soccer for the Americans watching, was banned for servants and laborers via a national statute in 1388. Instead of football, these men were encouraged to practice archery so they could better defend their kingdom. The punishment for playing football when enforced included 6 days in prison. The law was not officially repealed until 1845. Tennis was also off limits, at least if the would-be sportsmen were poor. In 1485, it was declared illegal for young men who were below the noble class to play tennis. Tennis was regarded as an activity for the upper classes alone, and breaking this law would result in fines. Yet another ball-related sport was limited by law when King Edward III banned bowling in 1366, again citing the need for men to practice archery instead. But forget about food, fashion, sex, and sports. There was one force in medieval England that you really don't want to mess around with: the church. The Catholic Church outlawed blasphemy during the Middle Ages, and anyone caught speaking out of turn about God or other religious subject matter would be dealt with swiftly. Punishments for blasphemy included hanging, stoning, and being bound while one's tongue was removed with hot pliers. Let's get even more recent next. Maybe you're curious about the Tudor or Stuart periods, the early modern age of England. Many of the laws of the Middle Ages were left behind in the past but there were still plenty of unusual laws to watch out for. As a time traveler, you should know by now that you can't just wear whatever you want, whenever you want. There are obvious tips like don't wear jeans before denim was invented, or don't wear your Taylor Swift concert merch in ancient Greece. But there's also the lesser-known don't wear silk in 1500s England. In 1509, the Act Against Wearing of Costly Apparel was passed, and by 1554, an act to avoid the excess in apparel was in effect, prohibiting the wearing of any silk garments by any person with a rank lower than that of a knight's son. Don't expect those wimpy medieval fines for breaking the law either. If caught, the punishment was 3 months in prison and a fine of £10 per day the law was broken. So there were laws about what people couldn't wear, but there were also laws about what people couldn't not wear. In 1571, the Act for the Making of Caps required all people above the age of 6 years old, except for nobles and maidens, ladies and gentlewomen, to wear an English-made wool cap on Sundays and holidays. If you were caught without a cap, you would be fined 3 shillings and 4 pence for each day the law was broken. Hear that sound? It's church bells. Here come some of those good old-fashioned religious laws again. In 1559, as England became a contentious battleground between Catholics and Protestants, Elizabeth I passed the Act of Uniformity, which required church services to use the Book of Common Prayer and made Sunday service attendance absolutely mandatory. If someone missed church, they would be fined 12 pence. Later in the 1600s, the religious landscape of England was shifting once again, and Puritans dominated much of Parliament. In 1647, in an attempt to crack down on holiday celebrations deemed pagan in nature and not pious enough, an ordinance was passed that forbade the celebration of the Christmas holiday. Additional laws were passed along those lines in the 1650s, and those caught celebrating Christmas with parties or other festivities could be fined or have their personal property seized. So if you're visiting England from 1647 to 1660, don't expect any Christmas party invites. Now let's head on over to the good old US of A and see what accidental historical crimes you might stumble into. Depending on the state, there are some really unexpected laws that are no longer on the books in the present, but that might pose an issue to someone visiting in the past. First, let's talk about drinking. Lots of people do it. But from 1920 to 1933, America was smack dab in the middle of Prohibition, which strictly prohibited the manufacture, sale, or consumption of alcohol. That's an obvious one. Most of us already know about Prohibition, but it's far from the only alcohol-related crackdown in American history. In some states, including Kentucky, it was once illegal to purchase any alcohol while the polls were open for general elections or primaries. No drinking on Election Day. This was in response to a specific issue with political parties in pre-Prohibition era America frequently bribing voters with free booze. The no alcohol on Election Days law was overturned in Kentucky in 2013. So that covers what days were forbidden for buying alcohol. But what about alcohol's temperature? Surely no one would legally mandate that. Just kidding, of course they would. That's why we brought it up in the first place. In Mississippi, it was once illegal to sell cold beer in a store. You were allowed to sell it at room temperature but not cold. This was intended to prevent drunk driving, as it forced beer drinkers to wait until they could get their freshly purchased brew somewhere with a refrigerator before cracking open a newly cold one. The law was overturned in 2013. Sure, those laws were a bit odd, but at least we're not in the Middle Ages anymore. There definitely won't be any more religiously motivated laws that restrict public life and leisure time. What's that? Yes, there absolutely were so many of those? Oh, okay. Up until as recently as the 1980s, there were quite a few laws in place preventing certain activities on Sundays. One of those was shopping or doing business of any kind. Sunday was a legally mandated day of rest, and if you had anything you wanted to pick up at the store that day, well, you were just out of luck. Thankfully, those laws have been repealed everywhere in the states except for Bergen County, New Jersey. As it turns out, not everything is legal in New Jersey. Other, more restful activities were off-limits too. New York State maintained their blue laws banning work and activities on Sundays, for decades, limiting shopping and alcohol sales, but also limiting the acts of golfing or going to the circus. These laws were relaxed in 1952, but prior to that, no looking at clowns or hitting balls was permitted on the Lord's Day. Speaking of fun things to do, specifically involving balls, you know what's always a good wholesome time? Pinball. That all-American arcade classic game that no one in their right mind would ever have a problem with, let alone try to outlaw, except, of course, for the time that it was absolutely outlawed. From the time that the first coin-operated pinball machine was introduced in 1931, it was considered a form of gambling that many wrote off as immoral and dangerous to society. It was a game of chance that cost money, and that was too close to gambling for comfort in the eyes of church groups and others, including Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York City. On January 21, 1942, pinball machines were banned in public spaces in New York City. The police raided candy shops, bowling alleys, bars, and any other public space that might have a pinball machine, confiscating 2,000 machines. They called the press to come and watch and smashed the pinball machines to smithereens with sledgehammers. Other cities soon joined in and banned pinball as well, including in Chicago, New Orleans, and Los Angeles. It wasn't until the 1970s when the flipper mechanism was added to the game and the attitude around pinball shifted to considering it a game of skill rather than chance. In 1974, the California Supreme Court overturned the Los Angeles ban. 2 years later, New York followed, and pinball regained its place in public spaces and the hearts of Americans everywhere. Games are one thing, but there's no way that there were any American laws on the books prohibiting expressions of joy and fun that are as ancient as humanity itself. Activities like, say, dancing. Oh, who are we kidding? We've all heard of Footloose. Of course there were anti-dancing laws. New York passed a cabaret law banning dancing in businesses without cabaret licenses, which was ratified in 1926. It wasn't repealed until 2017. And it wasn't the only dancing law. In the town of Elmore City, Oklahoma, a ban on public dancing was enacted in 1898. Like in the plot of Footloose, this ban was intended to prevent the immorality that religious leaders believed could result from dancing, including drinking and premarital sex and fun. Without Kevin Bacon there to save the day, the town's ban remained intact for nearly 100 years until Elmore City High School students rallied against it in 1980. The students sought to overturn the ban in order to have a senior prom. There were objectors like Reverend F.R. Johnson who said, "No good has ever come from a dance. If you have a dance, somebody will crash it and they'll be looking for only two things, women and booze. When boys and girls hold each other, they get sexually aroused. You can believe what you want, but one thing leads to another." In spite of his comments, the students got their way, and the ban was officially overturned. Now, hopefully you're a little bit more prepared for your travels through time, or maybe you've decided time travel isn't for you after all. If that's the case, then at least you know a lot of law-based trivia that you didn't know before. Either way, your chances of winding up in a medieval prison or being put to death in ancient Rome are significantly smaller than they were before, and you have no way of proving otherwise. How will cannabis survive the apocalypse? Did William Shakespeare smoke a bowl before he wrote a play? Why do you get the munchies after toking? Which presidents liked to get dank on their downtime? And can you smoke so much weed that it kills you? These are 50 chronically insane facts about weed. Fact 50. Cannabis is believed to be one of the earliest plants to be cultivated by humans. Mentions of it have been found in writings from as far back as 3000 BC, and possible evidence of cannabis use has been identified in Neolithic archaeological sites that are over 10,000 years old. Most of the early evidence of cannabis use comes from Asia, with prehistoric cannabis residues and hemp fiber imprints having been found across China, Japan, India, and the Middle East. Historians believe that these ancient cultures used the plant not just for its psychoactive properties, but also to make rope, clothes, shoes, paper, and even as a food source. Fact 49. Have you ever wondered where the word marijuana actually comes from? Well, there are a couple of competing theories. According to one popular story, it comes from a Nahuatl word meaning prisoner. This explanation probably isn't true though, as it was first popularized by anti-drug campaigner Harry J. Anslinger in the 1930s. The more likely explanation is that it comes from the Chinese mahren hua, meaning hemp flower. Ganja, another popular nickname for the drug, comes from the Sanskrit word for the hemp plant. Fact 48. People have had it out for cannabis for over 700 years. Throughout history, marijuana has been mainly used for medicinal and spiritual purposes, but even so, it's always been a pretty controversial substance. In fact, the first known laws restricting marijuana use come from all the way back in the Middle Ages. The earliest known anti-cannabis legislation is believed to be a law passed in the 1300s by an Arabian emir called Sodun Sheikuni. Cannabis use was also made illegal by Napoleon Bonaparte during his reign and was widely outlawed throughout the British Empire during its heyday. Fact 47. The United States has something of a love-hate relationship with the hemp plant. America started restricting the sale of the drug in 1906, but only made it outright illegal in 1937 when the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. For some reason, hemp was outlawed alongside cannabis, but that wasn't the case for long. Once the US entered World War II, the government started making propaganda that encouraged hemp cultivation. Since the hemp plant could be used to make cheap but durable rope and canvas, that was vital to the war effort. Hemp was then banned again in the 70s under the Controlled Substances Act, and the plant remained illegal until the Controlled Substances Act was revised in 2018. Even though the cultivation of hemp is still strictly regulated, in 2019 the US managed to become the world's third biggest hemp producer after China and Canada. Fact 46. Urkel has his own bespoke line of weed. In 2021, actor Jaleel White launched his own brand of recreational weed called It's Purple, a variant of the Purple Urkel cannabis strain. Jaleel White, of course, was famous back in the 90s for playing the nerdy Steve Urkel on the sitcom Family Matters. When asked about It's Purple by Forbes, White said he started the business because he was tired of seeing his character's name and likeness used without his involvement, and figured he could get in on the action. He even filmed ads for it alongside Snoop Dogg, where he was fully in character as Steve Urkel. Fact 45. Reggae legend Bob Marley was buried with weed. Perhaps one of the most famous tokers of all time, music god Bob Marley took the plant to the grave with him. When he died of cancer in 1981, according to some accounts, he was buried with a football, his beloved Gibson Les Paul guitar, and a bud of chronic. Hopefully, he's still lighting it up in the great beyond. Fact 44. There are over 1,000 ways to say it. Literally. Time magazine has reported that there are over 1,200 popularly used slang terms for cannabis, and here are some of our favorites: weed, bud, ganja, chronic, grass, wacky tobacco, reefer, herb, green goddess, sweet Mary Jane, Donna Juanita, pot, dank, and the devil's lettuce. If we forgot one of your favorites, let us know in the comments. Fact 43. Tupac's closest friends smoked him. And no, that's not a euphemism. When Tupac was tragically murdered in 1996, his old band and close friends, the Outlaws, claimed to have gave him a true rapper send-off, rolling some of his cremains into a joint with some weed and smoking him up. While some have doubted these claims, the Outlaws themselves have stuck to their story. Personally, we think this one's up there with Marley's coffin weed. Fact 42. A group of weed-hunting teens invented 420. It's one of the most popular codes for cannabis, and it's the reason that April 20th, previously best known as the birthday of the decidedly unchill Adolf Hitler, is now synonymous with sharing some herbal love. In the early 1970s, a group of high schoolers from San Rafael High School in California went hunting for a legendary weed farm in their area, using the code 420 to signify the hunts. While they never found the El Dorado of ganja, their story and their secret code got picked up by the magazine High Times and the band Grateful Dead, leading to the phrase becoming forever cemented in cannabis culture language. Fact 41. Washington was the first U.S. state to legalize recreational marijuana use. And this is kinda poetic, given the state's namesake, America's first president, George Washington, famously cultivated hemp crops. He was a big fan of the plant, mentioning it over 90 times in his personal diaries. But there is no evidence that he ever used it to get high. Instead, he likely grew the plant due to its valuable resource for manufacturing those sturdy ropes we mentioned earlier for use in ship construction. The original United States flag, created by Betsy Ross, was even made out of the kind of hemp that Washington loved cultivating. It's as American as apple pie. Fact 40. A lot of celebrities smoke weed. Seriously, it'd be a whole video to list them all, but some of the most prominent, famous, avowed potheads include Jennifer Lawrence, Kirsten Dunst, Miley Cyrus, Zoe Kravitz, Lady Gaga, Brad Pitt, Jane Fonda, Harrison Ford, Charlize Theron, Pete Davidson, Morgan Freeman, Patrick Stewart, Rihanna, Snoop Dogg and Seth Rogen, duh, Willie Nelson, Woody Harrelson, Kendall Jenner, and Matthew McConaughey. And those are just the ones who admit it. Fact 39. Washington wasn't the only president with a history of weed use, and these presidents actually did smoke it. George W. Bush is an admitted weed user, and Barack Obama even had a weed-smoking club in his youth called the Choom Gang. According to some of the Choom Gang's other members, Obama actually pioneered some new weed consumption techniques, including TA, or total absorption, and roof hits. And yes, there is a cruel irony to the fact that both those presidents smoked weed, but neither of them legalized it on the federal level. We guess they just wanted to keep it all to themselves. Fact 38. the government could be making billions of dollars from marijuana. Extrapolating from the tax money that states with legal weed have already made, it's estimated that across the entire United States, the federal government could make $8.5 billion in tax revenue, and potentially more if they institute a so-called potency tax, where taxation of cannabis is put on a sliding scale based on how potent the strain is. And even this is nothing compared to the money that private industry stands to make. It's estimated that if weed was legalized in all 50 states, it would quickly become a bigger market than organic food. Fact 37. The U.S. military experimented with weaponized weed. Researchers at the Edgewood Arsenal facility in Maryland pioneered dimethylheptylpyrin. Try saying that 3 times fast. An extremely potent cannabinoid agent that had an elimination half-life of 20 to 39 hours. That's some serious sticky. In addition to the standard sedative and hallucinogenic effect, it also caused low blood pressure, dizziness, fainting, ataxia, and muscle weakness. So much so that someone under the effects of dimethylheptylpyrin had difficulty even standing upright. Obviously, the researchers at Edgewood didn't invent this just so U.S. soldiers could get high on government-subsidized ultra weed. They were exploring the possible use as a non-lethal crowd control agent, but that fell through because of the potential risks involved to the health of certain at-risk users and the political sensitivity of working with weed. Fact 36. For some people, marijuana use is a religious affair, and some countries even legally recognize this. In Italy, after a lengthy court battle back in 2008, it was deemed that people of the Rastafarian faith could keep weed for purely personal use as a religious sacrament, and in possession cases it would be up to the courts to decide, based on the quantity of the weed, whether it was for personal use or trafficking. Fact 35. Weed is giving coffee a run for its money. At least in Denver, in 2011, some counts showed weed dispensaries outnumbering Starbucks locations 300 to 266. Weed dispensaries were so rife that a popular local magazine even had a weed reviewer who gave their take on the local chronic. Fact 34. Weed is the world's favorite illicit drug. While debate rages on about how exactly weed is classified, one thing definitely isn't up for debate: the fact that people absolutely love it. According to some data, 219 million people, that's 4.3% of the global population between the ages of 16 and 64, used cannabis at least once in 2021. Fact 33. One of the first sales ever brokered on the internet was allegedly weed. In 1971, a Stanford student and an MIT student connected over the ARPANET, the precursor of the internet created by the precursor of DARPA. How did these two students of two of the country's most prestigious learning institutions use this connection forged over a revolutionary new technology? To get high, of course. They organized the sale of weed, and in the process became accidental pioneers of illicit e-commerce. Fact 32. How much weed does it take to kill you? Well, we can only discuss this theoretically given that there are no recorded deaths related to cannabis overdose. Of course, it is possible to have a bad reaction, especially if you take too many edibles, which have a more potent high than smoking. But when it comes to drugs that are still illegal, cannabis is still one of the safest out there, compared to fentanyl, where as little as 2 milligrams can be fatal. Fact 31. Some people have proposed medical marijuana for dogs. However, while some pet owners have given anecdotal evidence of their sick pets having pain relieved by marijuana, most veterinary experts are skeptical. Dogs in particular are extremely vulnerable to marijuana toxicosis, especially when weed is consumed in a vector that dogs already shouldn't be eating, like brownies. So just to be safe, stick only to the treatments prescribed by professionals when treating your sick pets, or you could be putting their life on the line. Fact 30. Weed is in the air over Italy. And no, it isn't because Italy has a massive Rastafarian population who just love indulging in their newly legalized religious sacraments. We're not entirely sure why they did this, but Italy's Institute for Atmospheric Pollution Research decided to conduct a year-long study to monitor the effects of psychotropic substances in the air in 8 different Italian cities: Bologna, Florence, Milan, Naples, Palermo, Rome, Turin, and Verona. They ended up finding trace amounts of marijuana and cocaine in all 8 of them. Fact 29. A North Carolina hospital thought people were toking up around newborns. Social services started getting extremely concerned when urine tests from a number of newborns appeared to show trace amounts of marijuana in their systems, believed to be a result of secondhand smoke from overly mellow parents. However, when they dug deeper, they found out that the actual truth was even stranger. Chemicals in several different baby soaps, specifically Johnson & Johnson's Head-to-Toe Baby Wash, Johnson & Johnson Bedtime Bath, CVS Nighttime Baby Bath, Aveeno Soothing Relief Creamy Wash, and Aveeno Wash Shampoo, seemed to trigger false positives for marijuana. If this wasn't discovered, it could have resulted in some life-ruining accusations getting thrown around. Fact 28. Illegal weed operations have been killing off owls. In another valuable argument for legalization, illegal pot operations have been having a ruinous effect on local ecosystems. In 2012, 2 rare spotted owls were found dead in Northern California's Mendocino County. The culprit? Rat poison, specifically rat poison used by a local illegal kush operation to keep pests away from their crop. But it isn't just the owls. The fisher, a rare forest mammal native to the area, has also been put in a dangerous position by careless weed farmers. Rat poison has been found in the system of 85% of dead fishers found in the area, also believed to be caused by illegal weed operations. Fact 27. Is weed getting stronger? Researchers studied 36,800 samples of weed captured by the DEA over the last 20 years and found 2 interesting results. The amount of THC, the psychoactive compound in marijuana, has increased, and the amount of CBD, the chemical compound most often touted as having health benefits, has decreased. So when old stoners tell you that the weed was more chill back in their day, they're not just blowing smoke. Well, they probably still are, but just not about that. Fact 26. You can be allergic to weed. As if life for people with allergies wasn't hard enough, yes, you can also be allergic to Puff the Magic Dragon, both its pollen and its smoke. Allergic reactions can include runny noses, sneezing, irritation of the nasal passages, hives, and in one extremely rare case, anaphylaxis. For some people who experience allergic reactions to weed, it isn't actually the weed itself that gets them. Improperly stored weed can sometimes get moldy, and that mold sometimes has allergenic properties. Fact 25. Weed dependency is a genetic lottery. Like with all drugs, everyone has a different tolerance for weed, and the same goes for whether someone is likely to become dependent on it. Researchers have identified 3 different genetic markers as predictors for the likelihood of cannabis dependence. Fascinatingly, these same genetic markers are often also predictors for depression, showing that people who suffer from depression are sometimes more likely to use weed as an unhealthy coping mechanism. Fact 24. If you're an unlucky stoner, you might get cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And that might sound horrifying, but, well, there is no but. It actually is horrifying. Chronic cannabis users who suffer from the syndrome will experience periods of severe nausea followed by cycles of profuse vomiting and abdominal pain over a 48-hour period. That doesn't sound like a fun time to us. Fact 23. Drug traffickers can get really creative with how they smuggle weed. Here's a highlight reel of some of the most deranged ways weed has been smuggled. 766 pounds of pot hidden in broccoli, 1,500 pounds hidden in coconuts, 4,000 pounds hidden in fake limes, $500,000 worth of it hidden in fake carrots, and even weed hidden in vats of strawberry jam. It's kind of weird how most of them are just fruits and vegetables. Let's see some creativity, guys. Fact 22. Debates have raged on for years on whether Shakespeare liked to partake in a bit of the devil's lettuce. During an excavation of the immortal bard's home, 2 pipes were found with, among other things, cannabis residue. Immediately this, plus Shakespeare's reference to a noted weed during one of his sonnets, had people claiming that one of history's greatest playwrights was an avowed stoner. This immediately led to scholarly debate after scholarly debate, with some on the side of weed, and the skeptics claiming that there's no proof that the pipes even belonged to Shakespeare. The debate has raged on for so long that Francis Thackeray, an anthropologist from South Africa, has requested the opportunity to exhume Shakespeare's grave and test his remains for any traces of cannabis. They might be taking this a little bit too seriously. Fact 21. Weed might change how you think about money. Studies have shown that cannabis reduces activity in the nucleus accumbens, a reward center of the brain involved in dopamine production. Those under the influence of cannabis are less likely to produce the kind of dopamine that motivates them toward external rewards, like money. That's why it can sometimes be difficult to get anything done while you're high. That and the fact that you're spending too much time thinking about old SpongeBob SquarePants episodes. Where does he get those pants? Fact 20. Why does weed give you the famous munchies? It's all down to the 3 magic letters THC. It stimulates the endocannabinoid receptors in the brain, which connect to regulation centers for everything from dopamine production to hunger. In most users, this triggers an appetite increase that has them reaching for the potato chips. While to most people this is just a little annoying, it can actually serve as a major medicinal effect for people undergoing a loss of appetite during chemotherapy. Medical marijuana can even get these in-treatment cancer patients eating again, which is a huge boon for their overall health and quality of life. Fact 19. The Rastafarians aren't the only religious group who use cannabis in holy ceremonies. And we do mean holy ceremonies, with an I. During the Festival of Colors, many Hindus enjoy a nice, refreshing cup of Thandai, which literally means cooling off. But for some, the Thandai is a little holier than others because it's spiked with bhang, an edible strain of cannabis found in India. Partakers have reported feeling a light, pleasant buzz upon consumption. The holy significance of the bhang-triggered Thandai links to an old tale about Lord Shiva, but that's a little too much to get into in a video about fun weed facts. Fact 18. Cannabis can be used to treat epilepsy. As a life-threatening chronic condition that's believed to affect around 50 million people globally, doctors and scientists are always looking for new treatment options for sufferers. Thankfully, certain synthetic cannabinoids have shown promise in reducing the severity of seizures. The FDA-approved drug Epidiolex has been effective in treating two different extremely rare and dangerous forms of epilepsy, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome. And as cannabis laws continue to relax, even more of the medicinal possibilities of cannabis are likely to be explored by researchers. Fact 17. In some cases, cannabis can actually help treat other addictions. The lighter side of the nucleus accumbens dulling comes with the fact that cannabis use can reduce cravings for other addictive substances if a person is trying to break their habit. This is true for more common addictions like alcohol, as well as some of the harder addictions. In more extreme cases, cannabis has even been an unexpected boon in helping people affected by the opioid epidemic. Fact 16. If you're at genetic risk of schizophrenia, you should keep off the grass. While this won't be the case with most users, multiple studies have shown that people genetically predisposed to psychotic disorders, like schizophrenia, may see their chances of developing symptoms worsen, especially if they use cannabis or are exposed to cannabis use earlier in life. In addition to lowering cognitive function with extended use, it increases the likelihood of hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia. Plenty of cannabis users report temporary paranoia during use, but when you're still experiencing it between sessions, then maybe it's time to lay off the leaf. Fact 15. One of the biggest steps back for America's marijuana legalization came with one of its most controversial presidents, Tricky Dick himself, Richard Nixon. As we know from the hours upon hours of rambling recordings he took of himself, Nixon's war on drugs was actually a war on disenfranchisement, intended to lock up and take the voting rights from hippies and black people who generally opposed his policy positions. And the racist legacy of Nixon's war on drugs still exists today. Black people are arrested at greater rates for weed possession than white people in America, even in states where marijuana is legal, all thanks to Tricky Dick. Fact 14. Why is an edible high so much different from a smoke high? It's practically a meme among weed lovers that while smoke hits you quicker, edibles wait for a bit and then hit you like a truck. They give a more powerful body high that can endure for hours and leave you in a living dream or a waking nightmare. So what's the difference? Why the delayed action and upped intensity? According to neuroscientist Nick Jikomes, the issue isn't that weed is metabolized differently, it's that it's going to get metabolized to different degrees in different parts of the body, depending on the route of administration. The real difference between edibles and smoking or vaping is that with edibles, a much larger fraction of delta-9 THC makes it to the liver first. There it gets converted to 11-hydroxy-THC. So in other words, if you smoke or vape, the ratio of 11-hydroxy-THC to delta-9 THC is quite low, and if you take an edible, it's much higher. Fact 13. Weed will survive the apocalypse. That's because cannabis seeds are just one of the many samples kept at Svalbard Global Seed Vault. They store over 21,500 cannabis seeds from 17 different countries, kept safe and sound in the event of an ecological collapse or a world-ending cataclysm. So don't worry if you're part of the post-apocalyptic tribe or a Mad Max-style raider gang in the wasteland, you can still enjoy a toke at the end of the day. Fact 12. The inventor of weed brownies was a plucky American activist, Mary Jane Rathbun, and no, that isn't why weed is called Mary Jane, it's just a funny coincidence, was also known as Brownie Mary, and was a pioneer for both cannabis legalization and the rights and protections of people suffering from AIDS at the height of the AIDS crisis. As part of her charity work for AIDS patients, she'd bake cannabis into brownies and give them out, and in the process, she noticed that it seemed to alleviate some of their suffering related to their illness. Her work is likely one of the many important foundations for cannabis research and activism to this day, and her work is still used despite her passing away from a heart attack in 1999. Fact 11. In Bhutan, the weed is as plentiful as it is illegal. It naturally grows there, especially in the Bhutanese countryside where it's so prolific that in some places it grows out of the cracks in pavements. It's illegal to cultivate it as a drug in Bhutan, but farmers often feed it to their pigs to fatten them up. Maybe humans will someday get that privilege when the pigs get high enough to actually fly. Fact 10. A dangerous weed rumor about North Korea often does the rounds. Reported by a number of 420-friendly publications like High Times and Mary Jane, it was an urban legend that despite all the other dystopian restrictions, the North Korean government is surprisingly chill about cannabis use, especially for tourists. While this is the kind of wacky North Korea fact that does numbers on the internet, it is something that might get you imprisoned or killed if you take it too seriously. While hemp is cultivated as an industrial production material in North Korea, cannabis is classified with the same drug restrictions as heroin and cocaine. And given the horrible fates undergone by tourists in North Korea for something as seemingly minor as stealing a political poster, you really should not take your chances breaking any of their laws. Or better yet, just don't go there. Fact 9. Who has the world's cheapest and most expensive cannabis? In a study conducted in 2018, it was found that Japan had the world's most expensive green, coming in at $32 per gram. If flying high in the land of the rising sun feels a little steep for your wallet, then you'd be better off vacationing in Quito, Ecuador, where the price of marijuana averages $1.34 per gram. Fact 8. Malaysia has some of the most brutal anti-drug laws in the world. Planting a single cannabis seed will put you in prison for the rest of your life. Being caught possessing 20 grams will get you lashed, 50 grams will get you 5 years in jail, and a fine equating to almost $5,000. Up until 2018, having 200 grams was considered trafficking, and you could get sentenced to death. But now, it'll only put you behind bars for the rest of your life. Yay? Fact 7. Carl's Jr. once served a weed burger for $4.20. Seriously, back in 2019, as part of a special promotion for $4.20, they released the Rocky Mountain High Cheeseburger Delight, which had a special Santa Fe sauce infused with a small quantity of CBD. It was only available for a single day at one of their locations in Colorado, but for any pot fans in the area, it was a day to remember. Fact 6. Ever been curious about the actual difference between a joint, a spliff, and a blunt, but been too afraid to look lame if you asked? The difference is actually pretty simple. Joints are small quantities of cannabis wrapped in rolling paper. Spliffs aren't pure cannabis. They're a mix of cannabis and tobacco in rolling paper. And blunts, if we can be blunt about it, are bigger loads of cannabis wrapped in cigar or blunt wraps, which normally also contain tobacco. Now, you're familiar with all the key weed smoking lingo. Fact 5. One man had the guts to smoke weed in the White House while weed was still illegal everywhere in the United States. It was none other than country music god Willie Nelson, who during the Carter administration snuck a joint into the White House and lit it up on the roof with the president's son, Chip Carter. It was thought to be a stoner urban legend for years until ex-President Jimmy Carter himself confirmed that the story was true. Rock on, Willie. Fact 4. Weed has been inspiring Hollywood movies for almost a century. Stoner comedy is a movie institution, with stoned adventures being seen in Pineapple Express, Dude, Where's My Car, and the Harold and Kumar trilogy. But the first ever movie inspired by weed was 1936's Reefer Madness. But this wasn't a comedy, at least not intentionally. It was a propaganda movie that implied smoking weed would turn you into a violent psychopathic killer and lead your life to ruin. Ironically, a lot of people get high to watch and laugh at it today. Fact 3. There are some negative side effects of smoking weed that you should look out for. While a lot of weed's impacts have historically been overblown as part of government scare campaigns, there are some scientifically proven negative effects. These include increased heart rate, which has been recorded as lasting for up to 3 hours after the user smoked. Breathing problems, since putting any kind of smoke into your lungs is going to irritate your airways. Chronic weed users also experience the classic smoker's cough and experience unpleasant phlegm buildup that leads to them coughing up gross gunk. And then there's the vomiting, nausea, paranoia, and sometimes even hallucinations that we mentioned earlier. And in the long run, chronic cannabis users might find themselves struggling with sleep issues, as well as difficulty self-motivating. This won't be true for all users, but there's always a non-zero chance. Fact 2. You can actually experience weed withdrawals when trying to come off the stuff. While experiencing the negative side effects of quitting weed is actually quite rare and is nothing like coming off of harder drugs like heroin, there are a constant set of symptoms for those who do suffer from weed withdrawals. So what can you expect from experiencing weed withdrawals? The most common symptoms include reduced appetite, the opposite of the famous munchies, mood swings, and a general sense of irritability, difficulty sleeping, including insomnia and strange dreams, headaches, an inability to focus, weed cravings, chills and cold sweats, digestive issues, and a general feeling of depression. That's why a lot of chronic users struggle to come off the stuff. And of course, Fact 1. The U.S. Coast Guard seized 54 tons of marijuana in a single bust back in 1977. The night train seizure occurred off the coast of Florida and was the beginning of Operation Stopgap, the first interagency initiative to stop drug trafficking. It was carried out by the Coast Guard, the DEA, and the federal marshals, and remains one of the biggest weed busts in history. Whoa, watch your step there, soldier. What was that sound? Was that the click of a pressure plate underfoot or the snag of a tripwire? Hold still. Stay calm and breathe slowly if you want to make it out alive. Across the history of warfare, human beings have come up with plenty of inventive ways to kill each other, including methods that don't even require another person to carry out the deed. From hidden bombs activated by unsuspecting passersby, to punji sticks, pits full of snakes, to sabotaged ammunition. These are some of the most insane booby traps ever deployed in war. Starting out with one of the most familiar and frighteningly widely used human rights violation devices, we mean booby traps, is none other than the humble landmine. It's also the first of many of the traps on this list that are designed to blow up enemy combatants without the need for a soldier to manually trigger a detonator. Turns out, a lot of booby traps revolve around explosions, and that makes a degree of sense, right? If the goal is to kill someone from the safety of several miles away, then something that makes a nice big blast is more likely to get the job done. Typically, landmines are buried beneath the ground, but not too deep. We're only talking just below the surface level. After all, too much dirt between them and their targets isn't going to make for a very effective trap now, is it? Upon hearing the mention of the word landmines, most will immediately picture the same thing: a circular, encased explosive charge that's either detonated by the weight of a footfall on a pressure pad or put on a timer to explode after a set delay. Say if you were to bury a few in an area that you knew an enemy convoy will be passing through in an hour's time, for example. But one of the earliest precursors to landmines as we know them actually came into use during World War I, when German troops buried extra artillery shells in the ground to catch unsuspecting British and French forces by surprise. Since their increased usage during the Second World War, landmines have undergone a few variations, with many swapping out their metal casing for plastic ones, so they're a little harder to detect by those tasked with sweeping minefields. The main use of landmines is to disrupt larger attacks by infantry or tanks, and there exists two different basic types for each: anti-tank mines designed to destroy vehicles, and anti-personnel mines which explode into small fragments to kill or wound soldiers. However, the big problem with landmines is they can't tell who's stepping on them, and there's no way of distinguishing between civilians and soldiers. Given that mines are designed to be exploded by proximity or direct contact with a person, and the sheer number of them that are left unexploded and discarded on former battlefields, landmines are still able to pose a threat to innocent lives. As such, in May of 1996, over 120 countries signed a treaty to ban the manufacture and use of anti-personnel landmines, destroy their own stockpiles, and help clear any minefields within their own borders. The only countries that didn't sign were Russia, China, and the good old United States of America. Way before soldiers started using mines on land, though, the naval forces of the world had been using a similar tactic at sea for about 100 years before landmines started to be developed and deployed. Submarine mines, or sea mines, were similar in concept to landmines, with the main differences being their overall designs and the fact that they were in use as early as the mid-19th century. The most common type of sea mine contained about 500 pounds of explosives within a steel sphere. These would be left in the water by specialized ships, known as minesweepers, or dropped from aircraft. Defensively, they were left in locations surrounding important harbors or other military installations, or placed in areas of the water where enemy vessels were expected to pass. The mine's spherical shape enabled them to float, given that they would contain enough air so that they wouldn't just sink down to the seabed once the mine was anchored in place. In order to detonate a sea mine, well, just ask that poor guy from Hot Fuzz who found out pretty intimately how they work. The most common mechanism was a contact rod, which are protruding spikes or antennae poking out from a sphere casing. When they're struck by a passing ship, these rods activate a firing mechanism within the mine, causing a detonation, and one hell of a splash. However, water on deck will be the least of your worries when your hull has a massive hole in it. Throughout the Second World War, the Axis powers and the Allied forces laid more than 550,000 mines at sea, with the Allies alone losing 1,118 of their vessels to sea mine explosions. The Nazis and other Axis powers lost almost 200 more, with a total of 1,316 ships destroyed by sea mines. Of course, finding an explosive in a place you'd perhaps expect, like a minefield either at sea or on land, is one thing. It's another all the more surprising thing to stumble across one somewhere you never see coming, like inside something that's already dead. There's long been a popular urban legend that soldiers during World War I and II, on both sides of the conflicts, would rig the bodies of their fallen comrades with explosives, set to explode when the enemy forces entered an area. While there's no evidence that this was a widespread, commonly used tactic in either World War, in the early 2000s, insurgent groups in the Middle East developed their own variation on this idea to spring explosive booby traps on US and UK troops in Iraq, the roadkill bomb. You see, the key trick with leaving any kind of booby trap somewhere is that you don't really want the intended target to spot it until it's already too late. But when it comes to bombs, there are some ways to make your trip seem a little more conspicuous. For example, a discarded parcel or an old oil drum left on the side of the road is more likely to get reported as suspicious. So insurgents in Iraq looked for a solution, something that was less likely to be noticed, and nobody would think to approach it automatically with caution. And frankly, nobody expects something already dead to pose any kind of a threat. They took to using the carcasses of dead animals to conceal radioactivated explosive devices, either hiding C4 plastic explosives or homemade bombs loaded with nails or ball bearings, to cause as many casualties as possible when the blast sent these small metal pieces scattering in all directions. While these roadkill bombs were rare, as many as 50 attacks like this took place in the Iraqi city of Basra back in 2004, with the primary target the British forces in the area at the time. Hiding a booby trap in an unassuming animal carcass? Sure, that's all well and good. Your target needs to actually stumble upon the rigged roadkill, and you've got to be within radio signal to detonate. What's even better? Hiding a booby trap in something that's not only familiar, but also that your enemy can't live without. Their Zippo lighter. Take a look at any photograph of the United States forces during the Vietnam War, and one thing will be abundantly clear: the American GIs loved to smoke. There was even a rumored piece of anti-war propaganda that claimed troops in Vietnam weren't just using their lighters for sparking up the end of a cigarette either, but they'd used them to set fire to thatched roofs, burning down villages during search and destroy missions. While that is still disputed, it does fall in line with the Viet Cong sneaking Zippo lighter bombs into the United States bases. Or maybe they too just noticed that the US troops couldn't seem to go 5 minutes without a cigarette. Whatever the impetus behind them, these sneaky Zippo bombs were packed with enough explosives to take off a soldier's hand. What's even worse is they had no way of telling a real lighter from one of those explosive fakes, meaning a GI hoping for a relaxing smoke could be in for some much more immediate bodily damage than the usual tar in the lungs. But speaking of the Viet Cong, they're still remembered as almost being the front-runners when it comes to deploying booby traps in warfare. In fact, when you Google search for insane booby traps used in war, you tend to find a majority of sources only talking about the Vietnam War. You see, while they weren't able to match the United States' military weapons or sheer force of numbers, what they were able to do was utilize guerrilla warfare tactics to both harm and hinder US troops. Where some of the American forces were underprepared for battle in the hot conditions of the jungle, the Viet Cong's knowledge of their environment as well as their determination and tenacity proved to make them a formidable force against the invading US. And one way they were able to utilize their surroundings against the United States was through booby traps. A lot of their traps were not only cheap and easy to make, but they had the added bonus of being both devastating and hard to detect since a lot of them didn't rely on mechanical components. A lot of them were simple enough to work on their own, meaning the Viet Cong could set them well ahead of time, then just leave them concealed with leaves for an unsuspecting GI to stumble across. Even worse, a lot of their traps were designed to maim, not to kill, allowing them to serve as a psychological weapon too. American soldiers caught in them were left harrowed, as were their comrades who had to free them. Arguably, the most infamous of the Viet Cong's booby trap arsenal was the punji sticks. They were typically sticks of bamboo, sharpened to form a spike at one end. These were designed to impale a victim and were also often coated with poison from local plants or smeared in, well, let's just say things you wouldn't want to get in an open wound for risk of a serious infection. Punji sticks were often left in deep pits that were dug in areas that U.S. troops were likely to be passing through, and upon falling in, soldiers would get impaled on the spikes below. In fact, these traps accounted for almost 2% of the wounds inflicted on U.S. soldiers during the Vietnam War. But remember, the point of a lot of these traps wasn't to kill, but to injure troops and slow their units down while trying to assist their impaled colleagues. Some punji stick pits had additional spikes around the edges of the pit walls, pointing inwards, making it harder for soldiers to climb out without causing further harm to themselves. The Viet Cong would also often dig pits close together, meaning that the troops coming to aid a comrade who had fallen could likely end up suffering the same fate in a neighboring pit. Punji sticks were also occasionally used in preparation for ambushes, with Viet Cong digging these spike-filled pits in spots where American soldiers were likely to take cover, only to fall and impale themselves on the sharpened bamboo below. Punji sticks weren't the only concealed dangers the Viet Cong left for particularly unlucky Americans. For U.S. forces, watching where they stepped was imperative. The wrong footing could land someone not just impaled on bamboo spikes, but also see them and their squad mates blown to smithereens. Grenade traps were hidden tripwires that were connected to hand grenades. Now, you may be thinking, well, that's not a very good booby trap. Grenades need someone to pull the pins in order to prime them. And that's a good point. And these traps worked by getting the unsuspecting soldiers to pull those pins themselves. How? The Viet Cong would attach one end of a string to a stake stuck in the ground, then the other to the pin of a grenade, causing the pin to be pulled when the soldier's foot caught the tripwire. Alternatively, the Viet Cong would pull the pins on the grenades themselves and keep the safety lever down to stop them from exploding. They'd very carefully put these primed ready-to-blow grenades inside tin cans, which were then fastened to trees and kept low to the ground. A tripwire was still part of the grenade traps like these, except in this version, it would pull these live grenades out of the cans containing them, allowing the safety lever to release and igniting the firing mechanism. Cartridge traps, also known as toe poppers, were also widely used by the Viet Cong, and these were as equally ingenious as they were diabolical. They placed the bullets, or the cartridges in military lingo, from smaller arms like pistols within small tubes of bamboo. Sounds pretty counterintuitive, right? Wouldn't the cartridges go in a gun? Or in a magazine that's fed into a weapon? Yes, we see you gun owners in the comments. Sure, if you're an American soldier fighting in a highly protested and unjust war, which one, am I right? Then you're going to be expecting to be shot at, with bullets zipping toward you, but are you really going to be planning for one to be firing off from right under you? That's the purpose of cartridge traps. Bullets in bamboo tubes were placed over a nail and then camouflaged with surrounding foliage, the tip protruding upwards. This was so that when a U.S. soldier stepped on it, the pressure pushed on the bullet inside, forcing it down onto the nail, which would ignite its primer and cause it to explode. Want to know the grim reason these were nicknamed toe poppers? These traps were again designed to maim so that the Viet Cong could launch an ambush when whoever was wounded was being treated for an injury. Cartridge traps could easily take off entire toes when stepped on, and while they were only meant to wound soldiers, the size of the shell could also make them fatal. As if spikes in pits, tripwires attached to grenades, and foot-destroying bullets weren't enough to watch out for in the jungles of Vietnam, how about the local wildlife unknowingly joining in the fight against the U.S.? Imagine you're a U.S. soldier navigating one of the Viet Cong's numerous tunnel systems that they use to conduct ambushes on the American forces. Suddenly, you pass what looks like a beam of bamboo, thinking it's just some kind of support keeping the tunnel's integrity together. Then, your heart jumps in your chest as you accidentally knock it with your leg and it tumbles over. But instead of bringing the tunnel down on top of you, a very irate, deadly bamboo pit viper comes slithering out, and you're the unlucky one who freed it. That's right, in something that sounds like it was taken straight out of Indiana Jones's nightmares, the Viet Cong weren't above using venomous snakes in booby traps against American troops. United States soldiers tasked with clearing out underground tunnels were nicknamed tunnel rats, given how often they were the prey of bamboo pit vipers. These snakes possess a venomous bite. While it might not have been high in toxicity, it was certainly something troops would have preferred not to have. A pit viper could quickly turn aggressive and not hesitate to bite someone when threatened. Their venom is both hemotoxic and neurotoxic, often causing severe pain and swelling of an entire affected limb, as well as nausea and vomiting. Another Viet Cong booby trap involved sneaking these snakes into their packs in the hopes that they'd bite any U.S. soldier that searched them. Leaving these kinds of traps out in the open is all part of the guerrilla style of warfare that the Viet Cong is remembered for. But just like with the Zippo lighter bombs, it's an added level of ingenuity to leave booby traps somewhere a U.S. soldier is bound to stumble onto it and where they'd least expect it. Enter the explosive flags, another way the Viet Cong booby-trapped their own belongings to get the better of any Americans that either captured or killed them or their bases. What was so ingenious about this booby trap was the psychology behind it, how it utilized the U.S. troops' blind patriotism against them. U.S. troops loved capturing flags, so if the Viet Cong were ever forced to abandon a location, they'd do so with the knowledge that their enemy would likely tear down, confiscate, or attempt to destroy any Vietnamese flag that was still left flying. So, predicting how the Americans would act, they rigged their own Vietnamese flags, along with anything else the U.S. forces might decide to steal, as a war trophy, with concealed grenades. These would then detonate when anyone attempted to lower the flag or move the pole to which it was affixed. The North Vietnamese Army, who the Viet Cong guerrillas were supporting, also used booby traps like this, referring to them as keepsake lose hand traps. Arguably, the worst booby trap to be caught in during the Vietnam War was simply called the Mace, and that name alone paints a pretty painful picture of what it entails. Named after the medieval bludgeoning weapon, this particular mace was a 24-inch wide metal or wooden ball weighing around 40 pounds, with several large spikes protruding from it. Upon snagging the tripwire, an unlucky U.S. soldier would find this ball of death swinging down from the trees above them, likely smashing multiple bones from the sheer force of impact alone, as well as wounding or outright killing them with its stabbing spikes. Similar to the mace were the tiger traps, but unlike the name suggests, these didn't involve unleashing big cats on U.S. troops. Instead, tiger traps consisted of boards roughly the size of a grown man, weighted with bricks, studded with spikes and barbed wire. Once a tripwire was activated, it would release a catch on a rope and cause the tiger trap to release, impaling whoever was below. Another in the Viet Cong's laundry list of creative solutions to clearing out pests, in this case American soldiers, was the bamboo whip. This one also used bamboo, which is famously pretty flexible as far as wood goes. So the Viet Cong would lash sharpened spikes to a long bamboo pole, pull it back into an arc, then tie it to another tree and rig it with a catch in a tripwire. The moment the American soldier caught the wire, the flexible bamboo would whip out toward them, impaling their chest with several sharp wooden spikes. It is certainly no exaggeration to say that the Viet Cong had the advantage over the U.S. when it came to booby traps. Look at how many examples we were able to get from just them alone. But of course, never one to be outdone, the Americans did have a kind of booby trap of their own that they intended to use to get one over on their Vietnamese adversaries. Referred to as Project Eldest Son, this covert operation revolved around sabotaging Viet Cong ammunition, making it deadly to those firing it, as opposed to the U.S. troops being fired upon. Carried out by the United States Studies and Operation Group, or SOG, for those of you who grew up playing Call of Duty Black Ops, the goal of Eldest Son was to intercept ammo supply lines that were delivering ordnances to communist combat forces throughout Southeast Asia, not just in Vietnam but also in Laos and Cambodia. Technicians working for the SOG assembled over 11,500 cartridges for AK-47 assault rifles, as well as nearly 560 heavy machine gun cartridges and close to 2,000 Type 67 mortar shells. But what did they do with all this excess ammo? Oh, they gave it to the U.S. enemies, of course. But these weren't your typical standard-issue rounds of ammunition. These were all decoys that had been specifically designed to blow up right in the enemy's face. No, literally. The rounds were dispersed at random into cartridges used by America's enemies, usually during patrols by U.S. Special Forces. Guerrilla fighters would then unknowingly allow these sabotaged rounds to be scattered into their ammo supplies, like how loose change gets mixed up and passed around from person to person, Except you're not expecting a quarter you got from a gas station to suddenly detonate. Then again, maybe you live in Florida. These fake rounds were filled with powdered explosives, which to the untrained eye seemed no different from ordinary gunpowder. If someone was unlucky enough to fire one of these booby-trapped bullets, it would either jam their weapon or worse, cause it to explode, lodging metal fragments from their destroyed gun throughout their body. Ouch! And who says that guns don't kill people? Under Project Eldest Son, U.S. Special Forces also similarly booby-trapped enemy artillery rounds, replacing the fuses inside of mortar shells with broken ones that would detonate while the round was still inside the mortar chamber itself. The explosion that came as a result was often powerful enough to not only destroy the mortar and any additional ammunition stored nearby, but also the crew operating it as well. The idea behind Project Eldest Son wasn't a new one, however. Booby-trapping bullets had been around for a while. The Second World War saw the earliest deployment of what was known as explosively formed penetrators. Hey, stop giggling. EFPs are small-shaped charges designed to pierce armor from a much longer range than a lot of standard explosive charges. What makes EFPs fall into the category of booby traps is primarily that they're relatively easy to make. In fact, they're still widely used by some terrorist groups today. Simple EFPs consist of little more than a metal plate and a container housing heavy-duty explosives. Once they've been detonated, it's not just the blast that deals a great deal of damage, but also the metal plate itself, which becomes a deadly projectile that can travel at speeds of well over 4,000 miles per hour, tearing through a vehicle's outer defenses. We've seen some insanely inventive ways that booby traps have been deployed, primarily for offensive means, to ambush, injure, or outright kill enemy combatants. But what about setting them up as a means of defense? Better yet, what if somebody used booby traps to protect an exalted commander long after they were already dead? Well, welcome to the tomb of the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang. This ancient ruler was so determined to be remembered that he had a huge necropolis built to honor his passing. His tomb was guarded by thousands of soldiers. Well, these warriors might not be flesh and blood, but terracotta troops that are partly responsible for keeping archaeologists from reaching their emperor's remains over 2,000 years after his rule. The other reason is because of all the booby traps. Come on now, a tomb full of terracotta warriors and booby traps? What is this, the underwhelming sequel to The Mummy? Actually, Qin Shi Huang and his booby-trapped final resting place was part of the inspiration behind the third Mummy movie, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. But rather than having a giant stone boulder roll after unwary interlopers, the real-world tomb is said to contain a plethora of deadly hidden traps that have actively impeded archaeologists from properly exploring it. But surely the mechanisms made to defend a tomb made thousands of years ago would have eroded and rotted away after that much time, right? Wrong. Since Qin Shi Huang's tomb was discovered back in the mid-70s, it's garnered infamy owing not just to the army of terracotta warriors, but also the numerous writings claiming the entire place is rigged with hidden crossbows and 100 rivers made of mercury. While this might all seem like tall tales and sensationalism, scientists have discovered that there are 100 times the expected levels of mercury within the air and soil in the reachable parts of the tomb. And when inhaled, mercury can cause permanent lung damage as well as potential brain damage. Additionally, the weapons of some of the ornamental terracotta warriors have also been tested, and the findings that these tests yielded do lend some credence to the rumors of hidden crossbows firing arrows at wayward archaeologists who got too far into the tomb. The soldiers' ornate weaponry was said to be coated in chromate, which preserved the metal, protecting it from rusting away after so many years. If these supposed crossbows were also treated with chromate, then some of them could very easily still be operational. And how's this for an added piece of evidence? While it could have been deemed unsafe for some other reason, the Chinese government did, for a time, impose a now-lifted ban on further exploration of Qin Shi Huang's tomb. Even now that the ban has been revoked, many are still reluctant to enter, and any future exploration of the potentially booby-trapped necropolis is on indefinite standby. Still, Qin Shi Huang would not be the only person in history to go to extreme lengths to protect his body. In the 18th and 19th centuries, grave robbers were snatching up the dearly departed, often selling their remains to doctors who used these bodies for surgical practice in the days before donating your body to science was an option. So some graveyards started implementing a security system in the war against grave robbery: cemetery guns. possibly one of the most American solutions to a problem ever. While you might assume that these were fired when a criminal tripped a pressure-sensitive trigger, the value of human life wasn't exactly at an all-time high during the 18th century. Oh, how times have changed. Cemetery guns were installed at night, so grave robbers wouldn't know which graves had been booby-trapped. Each one was fired via tripwire, which also swiveled the cemetery gun in the direction of the person who tripped it. Unfortunately, this meant that these early technically autonomous turrets wouldn't discriminate between a corpse-thieving criminal, a passing animal, or an innocent grieving relative of the recently deceased. Still, at least they'd be quickly reunited with their lost family members in a flash. The Viet Cong, overzealous emperors, and cemetery owners are far from the only ones to deploy some insane and inventive booby traps. The Nazis also had a few up their sleeves during the latter years of the Second World War. Driven by their desperation at an impending loss of the war, with supplies dwindling and constant defeats at the hands of the Allied forces, some Nazi engineers came up with ways to hit back at the Allies by hiding bombs pretty much anywhere they could. Rifles and helmets left discarded on battlefields were rigged to blow, as were the doors and windows of abandoned buildings in towns that the Nazi troops had previously occupied. Sure, if they were being driven out, they could at least take out a few of the Allied troops moving in and drive down their morale as a result. In an attempt to wound the Allied leadership, the Nazis came up with a strategy that revolved around sneaking booby traps into whatever the largest, least damaged building was in an area that they were evacuating from. They thought that anywhere still structurally sound enough would be an ideal spot for the Allies to set up a command post to conduct their continued advance, and a building like that would likely be where the higher-ranking personnel would be stationed. So the crooked picture bomb came into the picture. Sorry, we couldn't resist. Most of the traps the Nazis left behind would get discovered by Allied troops, either cleared safely or found the other way while exploring an abandoned building. The crooked picture bomb was designed to be missed during the soldiers' initial sweep and only detonated after the Allies had already established a headquarters in the building. Bombs were planted in hollowed-out walls and concealed behind a framed photograph or a painting. But here's the key element in how the Nazis intended to specifically target the top brass of their enemies. They leave the picture hanging slightly askew. The assumption was that an ordinary, common soldier wouldn't notice or think anything of it, but a pompous, pampered officer who'd spent most of the war out of harm's way would think to correct the error and straighten up the wonky picture. But little would they note that this simple act of feng shui would prove deadly. The bombs hidden behind those crooked pictures were rigged to blow the moment the frame covering them was moved, killing everyone in the room. It turned out the Nazis knew their enemies. This tactic worked, taking out a handful of Allied officers before the end of the war. And as far-fetched as it might seem, the Nazis also stashed, bombs in even more unsuspecting places. Imagine opening up a bar of chocolate only for it to detonate. That's so ridiculous we don't even need to write a joke for it. But yes, Nazi spies had planned to conceal steel and an explosive canvas under a thin layer of chocolate so that an unassuming bar would blow the moment it was broken. However, the closest they ever got to deploying these food-based bombs was in 1940, when 3 Nazi spies on the southern coast of Ireland attempted to sneak 4 explosive cans of peas into Buckingham Palace. But in a spectacular blunder, one of the spies asked a random Irish citizen to direct him to the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Naturally, the civilians instead turned them over to the police, and all the explosive chocolate bars and cans of peas in the world would do little to deter the Nazis' inevitable defeat in 1945. Speaking of the IRA, though, they were partial to using booby traps of their own during the Troubles. Both the Provisional Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and the Irish National Liberation Army, the INLA, would often attempt to kill soldiers from the British Army by attaching bombs to vehicles so that when someone started driving, it would cause the explosive to detonate. Around 180 of the deaths caused during the Troubles were the result of booby traps like this, with a majority of them laid by the Provisional IRA. Improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, are still widely used by non-military combatants, like guerrillas and insurgents. As crude but highly effective weapons against a more conventional military, they can be constructed either using military-issue components or relatively cheap everyday ingredients, making them a modern weapon of choice for a number of terror cells. And no, we're not going to tell you what household items you can use to make IEDs. We don't want another video drawing the ire of the FBI. Besides, You've all seen Fight Club. Entrances to various buildings have been booby-trapped to using IEDs to kill or injure anyone who sets foot inside, while vehicle-based IEDs have been used to target military installations. For example, in 1983, vehicle-borne IEDs were deployed in Beirut during attacks on the barracks of French paratroopers and United States Marines. Both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars saw widespread use of improvised explosive devices among insurgent fighters. Even today, the war in Ukraine has seen thousands of explosives, including mines and other booby traps, left scattered across the country by Russian forces. Some have just been discarded by troops, others have been intentionally left to kill any passers-by, whether they're military or civilians. It's been predicted the cleanup effort to fully dispose of these booby traps will take years. History certainly doesn't repeat itself, but it often does seem to rhyme. In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. At least that's what Ben Franklin said. We're sure you love to hear 50 facts about taxes. Maybe another time. Instead, here are 50 insane facts about dying. Number 50. We've all heard that your hair and nails continue to grow after you die, but is that true? Well, hair and nails do appear to become longer after you die, but it's not because they're still growing. It's likely because the skin around the nails has started to retract. After death, your skin dehydrates, and this causes your soft tissues to shrink. So that myth is just based on an optical illusion. Number 49. A few hours after someone dies, their joints stiffen and lock into place. This is known as rigor mortis. You might have already heard of it, but did you know it's only temporary? It lasts about 72 hours, but this can vary based on body temperature and other factors. Rigor mortis is caused by skeletal muscles partially contracting, and since they're unable to relax, the body becomes rigid for a brief amount of time. Number 48. You may have heard the term the smell of death, but have you ever wondered what that means? When people say that, they're either knowingly or unknowingly referring to a complex mixture of organic compounds. In this case, it would be putrescine and cadaverine. They're two gases that are responsible for that distinctive smell of death, created when bacteria break down the amino acids ornithine and lysine. Number 47. Dead bodies can look like they're covered in soap. This is known as saponification. When a dead body undergoes chemical changes, it can transform body fat into adipocere, which is sometimes referred to as grave wax. It typically happens when a body decays under wet, airless conditions. It's said to have the consistency of semi-hard cheese and a soapy, waxy texture. One famous example is the soap lady who's preserved behind a wooden and glass case at the Mutter Museum. Even though her body was given to the museum shortly after it was exhumed in Philadelphia in 1875, there's a lot we don't know about the soap lady, including who she might have been when she was alive. They do believe she might have been in her late 20s when she died, and x-rays revealed she wore pins that weren't manufactured in the United States until the 1830s, so it's likely she died in the 1830s. The soap man, who also lived in Philadelphia, is kept at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. They believed he was buried around 1800, and his body was discovered while digging a train depot foundation in 1875. What a coincidence! Maybe we should set up a date. Water and alkaline soil might have seeped into his casket, causing the saponification, but unlike the soap lady, he is not on public display. Number 47. Now that we've talked about the soap lady and the soap man, let's look at the bog bodies of Europe. Europe's spongy, peat-covered wetlands provide the perfect environment and conditions to create these bog bodies, bodies where their decomposition is slowed by highly acidic, low-oxygen environments. Some of these bodies found are said to date back as far as 7,000 years ago. It's also likely that many of them were killed during ancient rituals, which might be a preferable option than just dying by drowning in the mud of the wetlands. In 1950, the Tolund man was discovered in Denmark. After analyzing the body, experts believe he died more than 2,000 years ago, but the exact details of his death are unclear. Experts do believe his death was a ritualistic sacrifice to the gods. They also know his last meal was porridge and fish, since the contents of his stomach were preserved. Number 45. Something called necrobiomes can help in determining the time and cause of someone's death. A necrobiome is all of the bacteria and fungi that are found in the remains of a corpse after death. They change in a predictable, chronologically consistent way, which is why it's sometimes called the necrobiome clock. As such, scientists can tell when someone died based on the types of microbes in and around their body. Number 44. Sometimes whether you can be considered dead or alive depends on the state you live in. Brain death is a controversial topic on a personal and governmental level. In New York and New Jersey, if it goes against the family's religious beliefs, they can reject the concept of brain death. Number 43. Mummies were once used as paint dye. If you ever heard of Mummy Brown, you may or may not know how literal that name is. During the 16th and into the early 20th century, the rich brown color that some artists used was created from grinding up Egyptian human and cat mummies. Since it was often transparent, it was used for painting shadows, glazing, and flesh tones. Number 42. There is a place where you're legally not allowed to die. Well, kind of. Longyearbyen is a small settlement made up of around 2,400 people located on the Norwegian island of Svalbard. Many stories about this place mention that it's illegal to die in the settlement, but that is not technically true. The law only forbids you from being buried on the island. This is partly because the permafrost wouldn't allow buried bodies to decompose, as well as being a tough surface to dig through in the first place. Once Longyearbyen residents start getting into their retirement age or have serious health problems, they're expected to move to the mainland, where treatment or a potential burial can take place without any complications. There are some very rare exceptions made to this rule, though. If a person has a special connection to Longyearbyen, they can request to be buried in an urn at the local cemetery. Number 41. Human composting is legal in several states. Currently, it's allowed in Washington, Colorado, Oregon, Vermont, California, New York, and Nevada. Return Home is a Seattle-based human composting facility. They use organic materials like straw, alfalfa, and sawdust to turn human bodies back into soil. It's meant to combat the environmental impact that burials and cremations have. You don't even have to live there to take advantage of this somber service. Some have already had their bodies flown to Washington after they die. Number 40. There are human body farms. The University of Tennessee Knoxville's Anthropology Research Facility is known as the Body Farm. It enables researchers to study the science of human decay while also allowing law enforcement agents to train on how to recover human remains at crime scenes. Researchers can also look at corpses at different stages of decomposition, potentially helping future criminal investigations. Number 39. Embalming became popular because of Abraham Lincoln. Have you ever wondered why we embalm our dead? It started during the Civil War. Soldiers didn't want to be buried on enemy soil, and families wanted to give their loved ones a proper burial. Since refrigeration wasn't as widely available as it is today, they had to find another way to preserve bodies that would survive long train rides in the summer heat. Embalming was the solution. It was created by Dr. Thomas Holmes, who became known as the father of embalming. However, it wasn't used all that much outside of the Civil War until President Abraham Lincoln died in 1865. The government had decided to take Abraham Lincoln's body on a 2-week national funeral procession. They embalmed his body so he could be taken from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. Mourners were in awe of his lifelike appearance, which directly led to the popularization of embalming across the nation. Number 38. Now we know why embalming became popular. We also have to note that it's not really necessary. It's rarely required by law. In California, there's a law that requires bodies to be embalmed, but only if they're being shipped by a common carrier. If there are reasons you can't embalm the body, there are other ways to ship it without breaking the law. Also, while there are a lot of funeral homes who will not do a public viewing without embalming, there is no federal or state law that requires embalming. Number 37. When you're cremated, the average person will produce 3 to 9 pounds of cremains. This depends on the person's age and weight, but it's rare for it to go over 9 pounds. Typically, if it's lower than 3 pounds, the person in question was a child or infant. The cremation chamber, also called a retort, can get as hot as 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit or just over 1,090 degrees Celsius. But even then, it'll often leave behind bones that cannot be burned to ash. In some places like Japan, the bones are placed inside of the cremation urn. In Japan's case, the family will pick out the remaining bones with chopsticks and place them in the urn as part of the funeral ceremony. In the United States, the leftover bone will be placed in a cremulator to be ground up so it can be added to the urn. Number 36. During the Victorian era, British families would take photos of the dead. As unsettling as that might seem today, it was a way for them to commemorate the dead. During this time period, Brits would also cut locks of hair from the dead and put them in lockets, rings, and art, as well as make death masks with wax. By the mid-1800s, photography became more affordable and commonly available. This led to Victorian families popularizing memento mori photography. As the life expectancy for children improved, the need for death photography decreased. Number 35. It's common to see death numbers spike around Christmas, the day after Christmas, and New Year's Day. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 93% of deaths are attributed to natural causes. So why are the holidays so dangerous? Many people put off going to the hospital in order to see their family, and with holiday staffing shortages at hospitals, it's not surprising to hear that the number of deaths spikes around the holidays. Number 34. We've all made jokes about doctors having bad handwriting, but it turns out that joke might have been taken a bit too far. In a 2006 report on U.S. healthcare facilities, it was reported that every year, over 7,000 people die as a result of a doctor's messy handwriting. Thankfully, the rise of digital prescriptions have probably cut down those numbers. Thank you, technology. Number 33. Dead bodies are not inherently a source of disease. It's not unusual for people to worry that they'll become sick after touching a dead body, but this rarely happens. You're only at risk of becoming sick if the disease succumbed to a highly infectious disease, like Ebola. Just don't drink water that's had a dead person in it. You could potentially get diarrhea from the fecal matter released by the decaying process of the corpse. The belief that dead bodies are dangerous to the living began in the 19th century when miasma theory gained popularity. It was thought that bad odors carried by the wind or coming from decaying organic matter transmitted disease and infections. Dead bodies notoriously don't smell the best, so it was believed that if you caught a whiff of a decaying body, you were at risk of becoming sick. Number 32. There are people in the United States who have been cryonically preserved after their deaths. In 2014, Alcoa Life Extension Foundation claimed that they had 300 patients frozen in liquid nitrogen within their facility. Those familiar with the TV show Futurama and its main character, who was frozen in a similar manner for 1,000 years, might think that we're joking here, but that's not the case. The goal of the company is to freeze its customers until a cure for what killed them is developed. Once that happens, they'll thaw out the corpse and reanimate them. We just hope it doesn't take 1,000 years to find those cures. Number 31. You can be cremated in the water. As strange as that sounds, water cremation, also known as alkaline hydrolysis or aquamation, actually exists. The body is placed in a mixture of high-heat water and potassium hydroxide. Pressure is then applied, which decomposes the body to its chemical compounds. Water cremation uses far less energy than traditional cremation, and it doesn't produce any emissions like carbon dioxide, making it more environmentally friendly, although it is only legal in some states. Number 30. There are over 200 frozen bodies on Mount Everest. It's not atypical for climbers and Sherpa guides to lose their lives while climbing Mount Everest, and they're usually left where they fell. This is mostly because trying to transport a body more than 20,000 feet down mountainous terrain would most likely lead to the rescue team losing their own lives. It's much safer to just leave the bodies there. Oftentimes, those bodies become so well preserved that they'll even act as waypoints for climbers who make their way up the mountain, such as the famous Green Boots. To this day, Green Boots has still not been identified. Some believe the body might belong to Indian climber Sewang Paljor, who died while trying to climb Everest in 1996. The body is referred to as Green Boots due to the green coal-flak mountaineering boots that are still worn by the deceased climber. Number 29. There have been accounts of people being buried alive. One example comes from the 17th century England, where a woman named Alice Blunden had been knocked out cold after drinking poppy tea, likely due to the drink containing morphine or codeine. Blunden was declared dead at the scene by a doctor and shortly after buried in a local graveyard. Lucky for her, a group of children who were playing by her grave heard some strange noises, and when their schoolmaster checked the grave, they discovered Blunden was still alive. It would take an entire day to dig her out, and she was so close to death by the time they finished digging that they returned her to her grave once again, believing that she had suffocated while they were trying to dig her up. The next morning, it was discovered that she was indeed dead, but she'd also tried to free herself after being buried alive for a second time. The hysteria around being buried alive got so bad that in the late 19th century Germany, over 30 safety coffin designs were patented. While several were built and sold, there's no recorded proof that anyone was saved by a safety coffin. Number 28. The saying of burying the dead 6 feet under started with the Great Plague. During the London Plague of 1665, gravediggers were instructed to dig down at least 6 feet deep. We're still not sure why this rule was put into place, but there are a few theories as to why it was implemented. One theory states that authorities believed the deeper graves would keep animals from digging up the plague-infected bodies. Linking to the previous theory, it seemed that they also believed it would prevent the spread of disease. It may have also been to deter grave robbing, but no one knows for sure though. Number 27. When you die, your body can explode. It is rare, but it does happen. Due to a buildup of gases and fluids during decomposition, pressure can start building up and boom, decaying corpse bits everywhere. It typically happens to bodies in sealed coffins since the gas has nowhere to escape, slowly building up the pressure within the coffin like a pressure cooker. It's not so much a boom, but the lid will pop open. After that, foul-smelling fluid and gas would start leaking out. Number 26. Self-mummification is possible. Typically, it's easier to mummify a body in certain climates like peat bogs, arid deserts, and alpine peaks. However, Japan once had a Shingon sect of Buddhist monks who would mummify themselves. The practice is also known as Soku Shinbutsu, and it could take over 3 years to complete. Those who completed the ritual were known as Soku Shinbutsu, or a Buddha in this very body. From 1081 to 1903, at least 17 monks were able to self-mummify, but it's possible there are more that simply haven't been recovered. They would follow a strict diet, seal themselves in a tomb, and meditate until death. The practice was officially banned in 1897, so the last person to self-mummify, the Buddhist monk Bukai, had done so illegally as he performed the ritual in 1903. Number 25. A burst of brain activity during the dying process might explain why your life flashes before your eyes before your death. You don't need to die to experience this though. It's not uncommon for people who have had a near-death experience to report their life flashing before their eyes or having an out-of-body experience. In a small study that mapped the brain activity of 4 people as they were dying, there was a burst of brain activity after each person's heart stopped. A biomedical scientist at the Charlotte Marshall of the University of Liège believes it might be part of the brain entering survival mode once it's deprived of oxygen, as the heart stops beating and thus supplying oxygen to the brain. Number 24. Hearing is believed to be the last sense to go. In a groundbreaking study from June 2020, neuroscientists were able to provide empirical evidence that people are able to hear while becoming unresponsive as they are dying. They were able to measure the brain activity in hospice patients at St. John's Hospital and compare it to a control group of healthy young participants. The study showed that the dying brain responds to sounds even when the patient is seemingly unconscious. Number 23. People used to believe that touching a murderer who was executed by hanging could cure illness. In England from the 18th century until public executions were abolished in 1868, people actively tried to touch the body of the condemned, especially their hand. They believed it would cure a variety of illnesses, including swelling. Number 22. There are some animals that will not die of old age, although other things can kill them. We know of 7 types of animals that can live on forever as long as they're not killed by external factors: jellyfish, lobsters, turtles, flatworms, whales, radiation-resistant bacterium, and the tardigrade or water bear. Number 21. Some animals will grieve just like humans do. Some even hold memorials for their dead. There are at least 5 animals that are known to grieve: monkeys, elephants, dolphins, dogs, and giraffes. Elephants are even known to cry for their dead, bury them, and pay tribute to their bodies and bones. It's also not unusual for crows to gather around their dead, but not to mourn. They do it in order to find out how the crow died and learn how to avoid their fate. Number 20. In Madagascar, the Marina tribe exhumes their dead every 5 to 7 years to care for them. The ritual is known as Famadihana. Ancestors are removed from their graves so that the living can replace their burial garments with fresh silk shrouds. While the bodies are still above the ground, the living will drink, talk, and dance with their deceased loved ones. Before the sun sets, they return the bodies to the tomb. Number 19. Mellification is the process of preserving a body with honey. Herodotus, a Greek historian, claimed the Assyrians would use this method to embalm their dead. There's also a myth that Alexander the Great's body was preserved using this method, placed in a golden coffin filled with honey. It's most likely a myth, but Abdal-Latif al-Baghdadi, a medieval physician and historian, claimed to have once found a honey pot in an Egyptian tomb. Allegedly, they found the body of a dead child inside the honey, so preserving the body of a fully grown adult is not fully out of the question. But this method wasn't just used during ancient times. Some of you might have heard of the mellified man, a human mummy steeped in honey. What sounds like it could have been an accidental mummification is actually a story of body donation. According to Chinese medical records, there were men in the Middle East who would volunteer to be mummified in honey in order to create medicine for others. The volunteers would eat honey, drink honey, and bathe in honey until death. They would then be sealed in a stone coffin filled with honey, and it would be left to cure for 100 years. After that, the body would be dug up and turned into medicine. Now, before you get too excited about having a potentially human-tasting sweet treat, no one can really prove it ever happened. I guess Skittles will have to do for now. Number 18. In some ancient cultures, it was considered respectful to eat your dead. The ancient Melanesians of Papua New Guinea and Brazil's Wari people would eat the bodies of dead relatives out of honor. Number 17. Some people will live with their deceased loved ones for years. In Indonesia, the Toraja people of southern Sulawesi will often treat the dead as just a sick family member. They will regularly visit them, speak with them, and bring them meals. Even after they bury their dead, they do not see them as truly gone. They will carve wooden Tautau statues to match their loved one's likeness. Those statues will stand on cliff-top perches to watch over the living. Number 16. The death rattle is a common symptom of death. It happens when the dying person can no longer swallow or cough, as well as being unable to clear saliva or mucus from their throat. This creates a crackling, wet noise that amplifies as the person breathes. It can sound like moaning, loud gurgling, or snoring, and it typically doesn't cause any pain or discomfort. Number 15. Death masks were once used to commemorate the dead. The masks were created by placing a mold on a dead individual's face made of wax or plaster. Perhaps the most famous example of the death mask being used was during the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. After the Queen was beheaded, a mold was placed on her face and a hand-painted death mask was created in her likeness. Number 14. People can die from a broken heart. Known as broken heart syndrome or Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, this fake-sounding sickness is a very real thing. It happens when the heart experiences a surge of stress hormones that are often the result of an emotionally taxing event. High-stress situations like the death of a loved one, bankruptcy, being fired, public speaking, divorce, or a terminal medical diagnosis can cause you to die of a broken heart. Number 13. In the Philippines, the Tinguan people will dress their deceased in their best clothing, sit them down in a chair, and give them a cigarette. They'll have their dead sit there for several weeks, but don't worry, the bodies do eventually get buried. Number 12. In Ghana, you can be buried in a fantasy coffin. It's a popular custom in Ghana to bury your loved ones in a coffin that reflects who they were. The coffins could represent a hobby, occupation, or other characteristics. For example, a successful businessman might be buried in a Mercedes-Benz coffin. Number 11. In the Victorian era, there were different expectations of men and women for how long they would mourn. Widowers would only mourn for 6 months or less. Widows, on the other hand, were expected to mourn for 2.5 years. Men were often encouraged to remarry more than widows would be. Number 10. On his deathbed, King Charles II paid a great deal of money for a tincture made of human skulls. When he was dying, Charles II paid Jonathan Goddard, Oliver Cromwell's doctor, for the formula of his miracle cure, King's Drops. King's Drops were said to help treat gout and dropsy, among other ailments. The secret ingredient was a powder made from 5 pounds of crushed human skulls. It really takes alternative medicine to a whole new height. Number 9. Water can speed up decomposition. We've talked about water cremation, but in normal circumstances, decomposition changes happen more slowly in water, mostly due to a cooler temperature and an anaerobic environment. But once you remove the body from the water, the putrefaction process will likely accelerate. Number 8. There's a rare mental condition where people believe they're dead or are missing organs. It's known as Cotard syndrome or Cotard delusion and walking corpse syndrome. While doctors don't know what causes it, it often comes with another brain disorder like dementia, a mood disorder, epilepsy, and many other medical conditions. Number 7. In Nederland, Colorado, there's a Frozen Dead Guy Days festival. It's a weekend-long festival that's held in honor of Brito Morstowel, a 110-year-old corpse. It's believed Morstowel was cross-country skiing in Norway when he died of a heart attack. His grandson put his body on dry ice and brought him back to the U.S. in 1989. When his grandson had to leave the United States, his sister kept his father's body cryogenically frozen in a shed behind their house. After she was evicted from the house, Tough Shed would donate a better shed, and Delta Tech would take care of the body. Twice a month, they deliver dry ice to keep the body frozen. At the festival, people engage in coffin racing, frozen salmon tossing, costumed polar plunging, and frozen t-shirt contests. Number 6. One day, social media will have more dead people than living people on it. Researchers at Oxford University have stated that by 2100, there will be around 5 billion dead people on Facebook if the platform survives that long. At Facebook's current rate, dead people will outnumber the living by 2070. Number 5. Around 150,000 people die every day. This total includes all deaths from accidents, illness, disasters, and violence. Number 4. In 897, the corpse of a pope was put on trial. Pope Stephen VI exhumed the corpse of Formosus in order to prop him up on a throne and put him on trial. He had a deacon answer for the corpse since Formosus understandably wouldn't be able to answer for himself. The Pope's corpse was accused of violating canon law, perjury, and several other crimes. He was declared guilty, and his status as Pope was posthumously taken away. They also cut off his fingers and threw him into the Tiber River. Number 3. Bodies containing a lot of fat are often cremated in the morning while the machine's bricks are still cold, meaning they'll be one of the first bodies burned that day. Since their cremation will require a higher temperature for a longer amount of time, those managing the crematorium have to be careful. When heat rises too quickly, black smoke can start clogging and messing up the machine. Number 2. You can get a death erection. It's also known as rigor erectus, and it's usually observed in corpses of men who have been executed. It's associated with men who have been killed by hanging specifically. It's believed it happens due to the pressure on the cerebellum created by the noose. Number 1. Let's end on a cheerful note. Bees! There's a European tradition in which bees are told important news regarding the beekeeper's household, like births, weddings, and even deaths. Some people believed that if you didn't spill the tea, the bees would leave their hive, stop producing honey, or die. When Queen Elizabeth II died, we saw John Chappell, the royal beekeeper, tell the bees about her death. Did you know a group of activists used Muhammad Ali to infiltrate an FBI office and spill their darkest secrets? Or that an antiquated FBI system allowed a future mass murderer to illegally buy a gun? How about the time an FBI forensic artist photoshopped an innocent Spanish politician to look like the world's most infamous terrorist? The FBI has been said by some detractors to stand for famous but incompetent, or even the Federal Bureau of Incompetence. And these insane stories of FBI failures and bizarre behaviors from the Bureau's many agents will show you exactly why. Let's start with the tale of forbidden love, as in the love between a brutal ISIS fighter and an FBI agent who was supposed to be investigating him. In 2014, Dennis Cuthbert was a rising star in one of the Middle East's most feared terrorist organizations. This German rapper turned jihadist had become a key propaganda tool for ISIS's campaign in Syria, appearing in a number of propaganda films, including one where he's holding an actual severed human head. This probably hasn't made you think, wow, what a catch! But you are not FBI translator Daniela Green, who fell for Dennis's neck-chopping charm. Green, who was already married and yet still inexplicably fell for Dennis, lied to her husband and said she was going back to Germany to visit family. She then entered Syria via Turkey to be with her beloved and found, big surprise there, that Dennis Cuthbert wasn't actually a very nice guy, and that ISIS's general attitude towards women's rights can generously be described as a little bit dated. Already, having an agent defect to ISIS for love when she was part of a group that meant to be rooting out ISIS sympathizers in the States was an embarrassing failure for the FBI. But what happened next made this whole situation even more of a scandal. After a few weeks in Syria, Green became sick of the #ISIS life and decided to come home and face whatever punishment waited for her. When she did return stateside, the punishment she was given was actually shockingly light, a 2-year sentence, which raised criticism of favorable treatment because of her affiliation with the FBI. In an attempt to put out the flames of controversy, the FBI released a statement saying that in light of the Green incident, they took several steps in a variety of areas to identify and reduce security vulnerabilities. The FBI continues to strengthen protective measures in carrying out this vital work. They declined to comment further after that, probably just hoping to put the whole mess behind them. Of course, you can't control when you fall in love, in much the same way you can't stop it when you catch a case of dance fever. This happened to one FBI agent in the Mile High Spirits Bar in Denver 2018. Chase Bishop, aged 30, was off duty and having a good time, but for some reason, he was still packing his service weapon. If he'd just decided to enjoy himself responsibly at the bar, this wouldn't have been a problem. But the spirit of the dance possessed Chase, and then all hell broke loose. While he was bussing it down sexual style on the dance floor, his pistol fell out of its holster and went off, non-fatally shooting another patron in the bar in the lower leg. The possibly drunken Chase scrambled for the gun, but by then the damage was already done. He appeared in court a few months later where he pleaded guilty to third-degree assault and was given 2 years probation. He's far from the only agent you'll see acting unwise in the heat of the moment today. Sometimes the FBI expands its purview beyond stopping crimes and ventures into emergency disaster relief. Such was the case in May 2002 when a runaway barge caused a catastrophic bridge collapse in Webbers Falls, Oklahoma, killing over a dozen people. The FBI helped coordinate the local police and other first responders in the aftermath of the disaster, but who was there to coordinate the FBI? Lucky for everyone there, a high-ranking military official was on the scene, Captain William James Clark, dressed to the nines in his fatigues and ready to take action. He helped take command of the rescue efforts for nearly 3 days, showing the cops and the FBI a thing or two about military bravery and efficiency. Except, William James Clark wasn't actually an Army captain. He was a mentally ill man who seemed to enjoy compulsively pretending to be an Army captain. But in the panic of the situation, even seasoned FBI agents just saw the uniform and deferred to his authority. This would be one thing if military impersonation was his only crime, but he also stole supplies from a military surplus store, defrauded a hotel, and filched someone's pickup truck, claiming that they were needed to assist in the rescue effort. Clark then fled the scene and tried to escape to Canada, where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly captured him. He was sent back to the US, where he was tried and imprisoned for 5 years as a result of both this bizarre episode and a prior history of check fraud. When he was released from prison in 2007, he quickly went back to his old ways, contacting the Russian embassy and confessing that he was part of a plot to kill Russian President Vladimir Putin. The fact that anyone thought this guy was for real, especially the FBI agents, is embarrassing for all involved. Another one of the FBI's many duties is running background checks on Americans trying to buy guns using the National Instant Criminal Background Check system. And there is sadly a lot of room for error here. Take, for example, one young man who tried to buy a .45 caliber handgun in South Carolina back in 2015. The 21-year-old was not legally allowed to do this, as he had a previous conviction for a narcotics-related offense, but the data around his crime was uploaded to the National Data Exchange, which the agent running the man's background check didn't actually have access to, due to a clerical error made by the clerk where he'd first been jailed. Not enough effort was made to follow up on these issues, and when 3 days passed without a denial being issued by the FBI, the gun was sold. The problem was that the purchaser was Dylan Roof, who would later use that same weapon to commit a horrific racially motivated mass murder in a predominantly black Charleston church, killing 9 people. Then FBI Director James Comey promised a full review of the errors that let this tragedy slip through the cracks, and Richard M. Gergel, the judge presiding over Roof's trial, harshly criticized the FBI for a series of abysmally poor policy choices that led to a mass murderer getting his murder weapon. Jeez, okay, that got a little dark. Let's try for a sillier FBI fail to break the tension. Prior to his assassination back in 2011, Osama bin Laden had consistently graced the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and the organization at times felt like they were clutching at straws in trying to apprehend the world's most infamous terrorist. Given that bin Laden hadn't been seen by anyone in the West in almost a decade, it was up to an FBI forensic artist to create a mock-up of what a 52-year-old bin Laden might look like. They just happened to do so by sloppily editing some of bin Laden's facial features onto an actual photo of Spanish politician Gaspar Llamazares, former leader of Spain's United Left coalition. Naturally, Llamazares was pretty incensed by this whole development, especially given that the photo had been used on the FBI's Rewards for Justice website. He felt almost as though they had put a price on his head by association. Speaking on the matter, he said, "I was surprised and angered, because it's the most shameless use of a real person to make up the image of a terrorist. It's almost like out of a comedy if it didn't deal with matters as serious as bin Laden and citizen security." In response, the FBI claimed that any use of Mr. Llamazares' image was completely coincidental and unintentional, but that probably didn't make him feel much better. This embarrassing failure also muddied the waters on what had long been considered the United States' top priority global manhunt. What a bizarre and hilarious disaster. It's important to remember that even FBI agents are only human, and they're victims to all the same weaknesses as the rest of us, including the almost unstoppable urge to take a joyride in someone else's incredibly expensive Ferrari sports car when we have the opportunity. This happened in 2008, when a stolen 1995 Ferrari F50 was recovered, one of only 50 in the United States. The owner was probably overjoyed, and then things took a turn for the worst. The car was impounded by an FBI facility in Kentucky while the agents conducted their investigation into the theft. And when it was time to move it, the task fell upon FBI agent Fred Kingston. The thing is, FBI agents don't get paid the kind of salary that would ever allow them to buy a high-performance sports car like this, so he decided to take it for a ride with Assistant U.S. Attorney J. Hamilton Thompson riding shotgun, where the two of them promptly crashed the $750,000 car. The U.S. government refused to compensate the owner for the damages, claiming that it wasn't responsible for what happens to stolen vehicles when those vehicles are in the hands of law enforcement. It's just another incredibly expensive FBI fail. However, failures that just result in damaged property will always be at the more minor end of the scale when it comes to devastating FBI mistakes. Another example on the more severe end is the death of Ulysses Valladares, a family man kidnapped by a pair of petty criminals in Texas, claiming he owed them $8,000. When Valladares didn't have the money, the criminal duo kidnapped him from his home in front of his son and spirited him away to a residence in Houston. Later that same day, Valladares' brother received a call from the kidnappers, claiming to be members of the cartel and demanding a large ransom for his safe return. Rather than bargaining with the kidnappers, the brother made the reasonable decision to contact the FBI and alert them to the situation. However, this would end in disaster, as when the two FBI agents put on the case entered into the home where Valladares was being held, they shot and killed him instead of the suspects. It was an idiotic mistake that cost an innocent man his life and a young boy his father. While they sometimes make mistakes in the line of duty, the FBI tries its best to take its work seriously, even when the suspect it's going after isn't serious in the slightest. This is exactly what happened in the bizarre 2-year saga where the FBI investigated a mysterious online group known as the Church of the Hammer, which seemed to have a violent hatred for the most oppressed minority of them all, Goths. They tried to glean information from the Church of the Hammer's exclusive forum, God Hates Goths, where a lone Goth was desperately trying to convince the churchgoers, who claimed to be an even more radical offshoot of the infamous Westboro Baptist Church, that Goths weren't actually Satanists. These attempts to convince them failed, and the FBI became concerned by the hate group's increasingly violent rhetoric against Goths and other groups that they believed to be in league with Satan. The agents began their investigation, reaching out to people involved in alleged incidents reported on the God Hates Goths forum, only to hit a strange wall. None of the people they contacted had ever heard of the Church of the Hammer. What was going on here? Eventually, after 2 years of deliberation, they went straight to the source, GodHatesGoths.com, the group's official website, where they made a horrifying discovery: the whole thing was a joke. It was a parody website and a blog making fun of real-life hate groups like the Westboro Baptist Church. The FBI quickly closed the file, mortified by their mistake. We feel some second-hand embarrassment just thinking about it. And now an embarrassing failure brought about by one of the FBI's most formidable opponents. No, we don't mean a diabolical serial killer, a connected mafioso, or a domestic terrorist cell. We're talking about the activist group Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI. This small but incredibly resourceful group of anti-war activists made it their business to stamp out government corruption in the only way they could: by acts of espionage that allowed them to bring the dirty secrets of various government operations to light. In 1971, this ragtag group of believers was about to take on the FBI and win. The operation that led to the FBI experiencing so much embarrassment was centered around one of their headquarters in Medea, Pennsylvania, where a huge cache of sensitive files was being stored at the time. The idea of somebody having the guts to rob an FBI building was almost unthinkable, so nobody was particularly suspicious when a young female student reporter approached the building and asked if she could conduct interviews with some of the people inside. She was writing a report about jobs for women for her school newspaper. Little did the FBI know this woman wasn't a student reporter. She was Bonnie Raines, a member of the commission, who was using her access to case the building for potential vulnerabilities that she and her team could exploit. She didn't give her real name and even wore gloves the entire time to avoid leaving any prints. Nobody suspected a thing. You see, the commission had a talent for infiltrating government buildings in strange and creative ways that nobody ever saw coming. In 1970, a year before the FBI raid, they infiltrated a draft office in Delaware that was recruiting people for the much-maligned Vietnam War. The door had locks that none of them were able to break, so a few hours before the break-in, they wrote a note reading, "Please don't lock this door tonight," and taped it to the entrance. In a feat of truly impressive social engineering, nobody locked the door that night, so they were able to enter and steal files on the selective surface. But the FBI building required a little more finesse. Another member of the break-in team was Keith Forsyth, who'd been training as a locksmith in order to learn the necessary skills to become a master infiltrator. But locks were only one part of the story. They needed to pick the perfect time to infiltrate, and that time was the evening of March 8, 1971, the same night that Muhammad Ali was set to face off against Joe Frazier in the aptly named Fight of the Century. The Commission infiltration team figured that everyone would be so glued to their television sets and radios to hear the recap of the fight that nobody would notice them breaking in. And miraculously, they were right. However, when the 8-member team descended onto the building, there was an immediate complication. The lock on the door was much more complicated than Keith had first anticipated. In the end, he had to settle for using a crowbar to pry the door open, allowing the team to enter and steal over 1,000 documents, while anyone who could have protected them was too invested in boxing. This would be a humiliating enough failure for the FBI, but the significance of what the Commission uncovered that night took the embarrassment to a whole new level. The Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI had just uncovered its darkest secret, COINTELPRO. This was a plot first started by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, which created a mandate for the ruthless persecution of people of color and activist groups across the United States, which had spied, threatened, intimidated, blackmailed, and even killed various left-wing figures. Ironically, one of these people was Muhammad Ali himself, who'd earned the ire of the FBI by being a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War and also converting to Islam. He and the Commission had unknowingly helped each other out. They sent the COINTELPRO files to various news organizations around the country, with the Washington Post eventually publishing the files and creating an earth-shaking scandal for the FBI that made them shut down the entire COINTELPRO program. And the cherry of the failure on top of this ridiculous fail Sunday, they never actually caught the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. We only know any of their names and thought processes around this because they went public in 2014 after the statute of limitations for their crimes had been reached, making them untouchable for the FBI. The United States' premier crime-fighting body was outfoxed by a group of activists in their 20s. But sometimes the activists don't even need to make the first move to be involved in a pretty humiliating FBI failure. Such was the case with a couple of anti-war activists named Mick Kelly and Lyndon Gaboy. The FBI raided their Minneapolis home to discover whether they had any terroristic intentions, but their search came up clean. The FBI clearly felt guilty for inconveniencing the poor couple over nothing, so they left them a gift: several highly classified FBI files. The couple didn't even find them until 2 weeks after the failed raid, but when they did, they were gobsmacked at the information they were seeing. There were photos of other apartments they searched, multi-page investigation plans, interrogation questions, and information on other Minneapolis residents that they were hoping to search. With the counsel of his lawyer, Mick Kelly released these files to the media, and an FBI spokesperson later confirmed they all appeared to be legitimate. There was one file left behind that was so secretive Kelly chose not to release it after being advised against it by his lawyer. It contained the names and personal details of FBI agents. This is certainly an extremely embarrassing situation for the FBI, but they honestly got off lucky here. If these same documents were left in the hands of actual dangerous criminals rather than a couple who like to protest against war, it would have left some FBI agents in extremely compromising positions. But sometimes the greatest threats aren't criminals or non-violent peace activists, they're the FBI employees right under your nose. Like Robert Hansen, a former FBI agent who was also one of the most effective double agents in American history. Hansen worked for the FBI for 20 years, and he spent almost all that time also being paid by the USSR and then modern Russia to undermine the United States' interests on their behalf. He was more proactive than most traitors, too, reaching out to the Soviets first and offering the names of undercover agents while keeping his own name a secret. Over time, he rose through the ranks on both sides, as the FBI became aware of a disconcerting number of their undercover agents being exposed. They put together the Soviet Analytical Unit to help find the mole behind it all, and the head of that unit was none other than Robert Hansen. That's right, the FBI put the man that they were looking for in charge of finding himself. Probably goes without saying that he did not do a great job. He was eventually caught in 2001, where he narrowly avoided getting the death penalty for treason, but not before briefly making the FBI the laughingstock of the intelligence world, making this probably the greatest of all FBI fails. The inside job that helped Hitler rise to power, a huge cover-up of the most horrifying moment of the Vietnam War, and a secret CIA weapon that could kill you without ever leaving a trace. They sound crazy, but ththese are just some of the most insane conspiracy theories that turned out to be completely true. And we're gonna let you in on all the secrets. The My Lai massacre cover-up. Sadly, there is no shortage of atrocities committed during the Vietnam War, but there is one so awful and so damning to the United States that the truth about it was intentionally hidden from the public. The My Lai massacre took place in the small Vietnam hamlet of My Lai on March 16, 1968. That morning, U.S. soldiers entered the village on a search-and-destroy mission. While the region where My Lai was situated was controlled by Viet Cong guerrilla fighters, the American troops found no sign of enemy combatants in the area, only civilians. That didn't stop the United States' own soldiers from setting the huts on fire, murdering between 347 and 504 innocent Vietnamese people, including as many as 50 children under the age of 4, and committing acts of assault so deplorable against the women of My Lai that we actually can't describe them here on YouTube. Even worse, the barbaric actions of these troops were initially praised by the U.S. as fabricated reports claimed that over 120 of these needlessly murdered civilians had actually been Viet Cong. The truth about the My Lai massacre wouldn't emerge until a year later and became emblematic of the U.S.'s war efforts in Vietnam. The conflict had already been widely criticized and protested, and now it looked like America had lost any sense of morality when it came to the actions of its troops in Southeast Asia. Military secrets around the killings ultimately made it all the more shocking when the revelations were made public when former soldiers spoke about it. These weren't just crimes against humanity perpetrated against innocent women and children by American troops, but acts that the U.S. Army leadership had conspired to sweep under the rug. Among the slew of court-martials that followed, Lieutenant William Calley was accused of directing the My Lai massacre and as a result was convicted of premeditated murder and sentenced to life behind bars. Sickeningly, he only served 3.5 years of house arrest before having his sentence commuted at the behest of then-President Richard Nixon. But if you think that's crazy, it's nothing compared to the true conspiratorial weirdness that came out of the Church Committee findings. Named for the U.S. Senator at the helm, Frank Church, as the chair of the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. This was a 1975 Senate investigation into alleged illegal activity carried out by the U.S.'s own intelligence agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Agency. Church Committee findings included multiple attempted assassinations of other countries' political figureheads, including President Fidel Castro of Cuba, as well as the presidents of the Dominican Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There was COINTELPRO, a covert operation conducted by the FBI to infiltrate specific domestic organizations like civil rights activists, feminists, environmentalists, people protesting the Vietnam War, and communists. It considered these groups subversive and sought to discredit them. The Church Committee also brought to light Project Mockingbird, an effort by the CIA to leverage its relationships with journalists to control the flow of information in the news. Project Minaret, wherein the NSA was working with telecommunications companies to monitor individuals on a watch list, a list that included Senator Church and other members of the Church Committee. And were it not for the work of the Church Committee, the world might never have learned about the horrendous CIA experiments that took place as part of Projects MKUltra and MK Naomi. But these weren't even the strangest findings of the committee. Stay tuned to hear about the CIA's secret weapon. The findings made by the Church Committee, as horrifying as they were, led to important reforms when it came to how U.S. intelligence agencies operate. Congressional committees were to oversee the future activities of the FBI, CIA, and NSA. And famously, President Gerald Ford issued Executive Order 11905, which banned the carrying out of political assassinations. Let's head back to Europe, though, and peer into the dark plot that helped install one of history's greatest monsters. This is the Reichstag fire and the Nazi power grab. There's no denying the Nazi Party went about assuming power over Germany in the most brutal way possible during the early 30s. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag, which was used as the home of Germany's parliament, was burned to the ground. The attacks were initially blamed on communists, with Dutchman Marinus van der Lubbe playing the role of patsy. Thanks to van der Lubbe being a communist, Adolf Hitler, already chancellor at this time, used the fire as justification for forcibly expelling any left-leaning or communist politicians out of parliament and had them imprisoned so they couldn't oppose the Nazi Party in the elections that took place a month later, in March 1933. Hitler successfully turned Germany against communists by declaring that they were threatening to take over, thus allowing the Nazis to win more seats in the elections and helping them assume power over the country. It's hardly a stretch to conclude that the Nazis were responsible, especially given how partial they were for burning books and attacking other institutions that challenged their fascist ideology. Operation Gladio. Would you believe us if we told you that following the end of the Second World War, armed resistance operatives were carrying out clandestine missions in European countries? No, it wasn't remnants of the Nazi Party or the USSR, it was the United States. Codenamed Operation Gladio, these covert missions were a direct collaboration between the personnel of what would become the Central Intelligence Agency, NATO, and the Western Union. Operation Gladio consisted mainly of stay-behind operations. This involved countries embedding sleeper agents in their own territories, who would lie in wait to be deployed in the event of an enemy invasion from nations like the Soviet Union, which was steadily amassing power. These stay-behind operatives would establish resistance movements within their home countries, and then, should a Soviet onslaught roll in, they'd stay put and work as spies from behind enemy lines. So what did Operation Gladio actually entail? Operatives were used to carry out political assassinations, psychological warfare, and false flag operations, essentially a smorgasbord of nefarious deeds against left-wing parties in Western Europe. This often meant aligning with anti-communist militias and right-wing terrorists, as Gladio's network of secret operatives captured, tortured, and killed anyone suspected of having communist leanings. To this day, though, the U.S. Department of State denies the truth that their own operatives were backing terrorist groups, and that Gladio was only a way to aid Western European countries from resisting a potential Soviet invasion. But the CIA messing with Europe is one thing. What about the FBI killing dozens of Americans back in the good old US of A? During the Prohibition era, the FBI was involved in trying to develop ways to prevent bootleggers from brewing illegal alcohol. In order to do that, they increased the amount of methanol, a poisonous substance found in the same industrial alcohol that the bootleggers would use to make liquor. While intending to discourage people from drinking, this increase led to thousands of deaths. For over a decade, the United States banned both the sale and production of drinking alcohol, and federal law enforcement devoted significant resources to tackling the illegal attempts people made to circumvent these laws. Speakeasies and smuggling networks were primary targets for law enforcement, as was bootlegging, which had itself become a lucrative business for organized crime syndicates. But the moment one operation was busted, another quickly appeared to take its place. To limit the publicly available supply of alcohol, law enforcement and federal regulators devised a new strategy. As bootleg alcohol was typically produced by distilling industrial alcohols, U.S. officials figured that if it became legally mandated that toxic additives had to be included in these products, then they could cut off the supply before consumption. So the U.S. Treasury Department ordered companies to add quinine, methyl alcohol, and additional toxic chemicals to industrial alcohol as a deterrent that didn't work. On Christmas Eve of 1926, 60 people were admitted to Bellevue Hospital in New York as a result of poisoned alcohol, 31 of which died in the next few days. Many had inadvertently consumed methanol, industrial-strength alcohol that was illegal under federal law, but extremely poisonous. And that's just a snapshot of the staggering number of deaths that occurred as a result of alcohol poisoned by these chemicals. While it's often misinterpreted that the FBI deliberately poisoned drinking alcohol, it can't be understated the unethical lengths that the United States federal government went to in order to curb public consumption of alcohol and illegal bootlegging. They might not have been dropping mercury into bottles of whiskey, but the U.S. government did increase the level of toxic chemicals present in industrial alcohols, knowing full well that these were being distilled in order to be sold and drank. Speaking of incredibly dangerous things to put into your body, ever heard of Project MK Naomi? The now infamous Project MK Ultra is often cited when talking about crazy conspiracies, but its successor often flies under the radar. Project MK Naomi was a joint operation between the CIA and the U.S. Department of Defense that ran for almost 2 decades between the 50s and the late 60s. The goal of Project MK Naomi was to conduct research into chemical and biological warfare, specifically determining what substances and chemicals could be used to either kill or incapacitate a target, and then developing devices that could defuse these materials. While MK Ultra had a strong emphasis on mind control experiments, MK Naomi focused on ways to weaponize bacteria and viruses, knockout gases, lethal poisons, and delivery systems that could be used to administer them. the CIA's Technical Services Division was tasked with developing a whole arsenal of lethal or incapacitating materials, with the U.S. Army Special Operations Command assigned to assist with the testing. After all, what are friends for? Perhaps most notably, MK Naomi led to the creation of a number of guns that were modified to fire darts coated in deadly biological agents. These were strong enough to incapacitate guard dogs, allowing covert agents to infiltrate an area. Then, a remedial chemical agent could be used to reawaken the dogs upon the agent's exit, covering their tracks as they left. While officially declassified information about Project MK Naomi is hard to come by, a CIA memo that proposed using biological weapons to target crops was uncovered in 1967 by the Church Committee, and we've got more about what else that committee revealed to the world coming up shortly. After this memo was discovered, President Richard Nixon was forced to ban the military use of biological weapons in November 1969, and Project MK Naomi was dissolved. However, despite the president's orders, in 1971 rogue CIA scientist stole approximately 11 grams of a deadly shellfish toxin with the help of SOC personnel at Fort Detrick, Maryland. This dangerous toxin was then stashed in a CIA-owned lab, going undetected for over 5 years. But it's not just the US that gets involved in sinister secret plots. Sometimes it's US allies. Such was the case in the Lavon affair. While arguably not as infamous as the likes of Gladio or other US-led covert operations, the Lavon affair was no less deplorable. Planned by the Israeli military intelligence in 1954 under the innocuous codename of Operation Susanna. This was a false flag operation. During the summer of 1954, a group of Egyptian Jewish people were recruited by Israel's military intelligence to attack multiple civilian targets in Egypt. This included Egyptian, American, and British-owned businesses, cinemas, libraries, and U.S. educational centers throughout the country. These recruits were instructed to plant bombs in these establishments, and upon detonation, the attacks were to be pinned on the Communists, the Muslim Brotherhood, a Sunni Islamist organization in Egypt, or unspecified local nationalists. The operation began when the sleeper cell, consisting of 8 Egyptian Jews, bombed the post office in Alexandria. Within weeks, 6 other buildings were also targeted, with the Egyptian government eventually being tipped off, allegedly by the person overseeing the operation, about where the next bombing was planned to take place. With that information, they were able to swoop in and arrest the bomber, then capturing the entire covert Israeli cell of 11 suspects. While the bombings didn't result in any civilian deaths, 4 of the operatives died, 2 of them after being captured, and another 2 being sentenced to execution by the Egyptian government. 2 more were acquitted at their trial, and the remaining 5 received varying prison sentences that ranged from 7 years to life. But the lingering question in all of this is why? Well, the intent of this failed false flag was to pin the blame on organizations that opposed Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. It was hoped that the subsequent chaos would convince Western governments that Nasser's regime over Egypt was unstable, and therefore prompting those nations to withdraw any financial or military support. After the operation failed, Israeli Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon was implicated in orchestrating the bombing attacks and was consequently forced to resign, leading to the incident being referred to as the Lavon affair. Israel continued to publicly deny that they had any involvement in the Lavon affair until as recently as 2005. The surviving Egyptian agents who had been involved in the attacks were awarded certificates of appreciation by the President of Israel, Moshe Katsav, the covert agent equivalent of a participation medal. But that isn't the last piece of military subterfuge we've got in the docket today. Far from it, in fact. So let's dive into the infamous Gulf War Syndrome cover-up. Following the end of the Gulf War, which took place between 1990 and 1991, a concerning number of veterans who had fought in the conflict reported developing unusual symptoms after returning home. Reports came in from the Gulf War veterans in the United States, Canada, Austria, and Denmark. But for those returning home to the UK and suffering from this strange Gulf War syndrome, the health issues they reported would be suspiciously silenced. In every reported case, soldiers who had been previously fit and healthy seemed to suddenly develop a litany of unusual illnesses and symptoms. These ranged from experiencing chronic fatigue, hypertension, muscle pain, cognitive issues, a lack of coordination, outbreaks of rashes and other skin conditions, diarrhea, as well as symptoms related to post-traumatic stress disorder. What made this so unusual, though, compared to the illnesses suffered by veterans of previous wars, was that there seemed to be a much higher rate of symptoms and at a much greater intensity among those who had fought in the Gulf War. The primary cause that's been attributed to this is exposure to sublethal amounts of chemical warfare agents, particularly nerve gas, as well as the inhalation of smoke from oil well fires, and exposure to pesticides and depleted uranium. In the United Kingdom, several assessments of the affected veterans were carried out to determine if there was any link between those experiencing these symptoms, but King's College London was unable to determine any common casualty among the sufferers. Meanwhile, other countries like the United States were quicker to recognize the existence of this Gulf War syndrome. The UK's Ministry of Defence vehemently denied that such a condition existed, despite the overwhelming evidence among veterans from the Gulf War. They would eventually relent in 2005, and subsequent research was conducted in 2009 that further confirmed Gulf War veterans were more likely to report symptoms compared to other veterans. They were also twice as likely to have suffered from PTSD and reported a poorer quality of life following their service. However, as recently as 2010, an overwhelming majority of the UK's Gulf War veterans hadn't received any form of compensation from their government, and claims for war pensions have been denied to those who served in the Gulf War and reported to be suffering with Gulf War syndrome. Sometimes governments conspire to shaft large groups of people. Sometimes it's just one very unfortunate dude. Welcome to the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair took place in France between the late 19th century and early 20th century. It surrounded one Alfred Dreyfus, an artillery captain within the French army. In 1894, after a seemingly damning letter of evidence was discovered, Dreyfus was accused of selling French military secrets to Germany and was convicted of treason. Wrongly convicted. Working in the German embassy in Paris, a French spy by the name of Major Hubert Joseph Henry uncovered a partially ripped-up letter in a wastebasket. The handwriting that had been used to pen the letter resembled that of Dreyfus, leading to what would become a controversial arrest and accusation levied against the man. The public were quick to believe the charges slammed against Dreyfus owed purely to the fact that he was Jewish. Anti-Semitic groups in France at the time amplified the notion of his guilt, especially the newspaper La Libre Parole, which explained that Dreyfus exemplified the disloyalty of the French Jews. Dreyfus was court-martialed and sentenced to life in prison on Devil's Island, located off the coast of French Guiana. In a harrowing public ceremony following his conviction, he had the French army's insignia torn off of his uniform and his sword broken before being paraded in front of a crowd who hurled anti-Semitic insults at him and even called for Dreyfus to be executed for treason. However, in 1896, evidence would come to light that implicated a different French officer named Ferdinand Vincent Esterhazy as the true traitor. This started swaying public support for Dreyfus, but after Esterhazy's subsequent court-martial, he was quickly found not guilty and fled the country. Dreyfus was court-martialed a second time in 1899 and found guilty again, yet France was still deeply divided over the case. Days later, Dreyfus received a full pardon from the French president, and then in 1906 he would be fully exonerated and reinstated into the army. Anti-Semitism is undeniably a horrible blight on the planet, just like nuclear war. And what do we have to thank for that? The Manhattan Project, of course. In a post-Oppenheimer world, almost everyone's heard of the Manhattan Project, the infamous World War II collaborative research and development program between the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada that produced the very first nuclear weapons, irreversibly altering the course of history. Between 1942 and 1946, the project resulted in two distinct types of bombs: the Thin Man, a fission-based nuclear weapon, and the Little Boy, the more complex implosion type of nuclear weapon, both designed by nuclear physicist and destroyer of worlds himself, J. Robert Oppenheimer. But at the time, public knowledge about the Manhattan Project was severely limited. The goal of security officials linked to the Manhattan Project was to keep word about the development of atomic bombs from reaching Nazi Germany and their Axis power allies, in particular Japan, who would suffer the first ever nuclear attacks in history as a direct result of the Manhattan Project. Details of the program were also kept a secret from the Soviet Union, despite the USSR being aligned with the USA, UK, and other Allied forces. The United States regarded them as a potential future enemy. However, some Soviet spies were successful in infiltrating the Manhattan Project headquarters in Los Alamos and disseminated information about the program back to Russia, which helped speed up the development of the Soviets' very own nuclear bombs. There was also a surprising amount of leaks during the 1940s from American journalists, some of them small and inconsequential, but others far more damning. Around the time of the Second World War, the United States operated a program of voluntary press censorship that allowed its Office of Censorship to sternly rebuke journalists that reported on a list of prohibited topics. Essentially, any censorship that took place usually went into effect after important information had already been published. One of the worst violations in relation to the Manhattan Project occurred in 1944, when a reporter for the Cleveland Press, the unfortunately named John Raper, discovered that a military operation was occurring in Los Alamos while he had been on vacation in New Mexico. Raper had no idea that atomic bombs were being developed there, but he erroneously reported the location and approximate size of a classified military science facility, provided local witness accounts of explosives being tested on site, and worst of all, he named Oppenheimer as the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. At the behest of Major General Leslie Groves, the U.S. Army's director of the Manhattan Project, the Office of Censorship was able to prevent any follow-up articles being published. This included one being planned by Time magazine to ensure further information about the project couldn't be spread any further. Groves also considered drafting John Raper in retaliation for his article, only relenting when he learned that the journalist was in his 60s and hardly at a prime age to be forced into military service. Next up is a scientific study that breached moral and ethical boundaries on a truly unprecedented scale. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a study that ran from 1932 until 1972. Funded by the United States government and carried out by the U.S. Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The goal of the research project was to examine the effects and symptoms of syphilis when left untreated, and at the time there was no known cure for the disease. In order to make their observations, the Public Health Service enrolled around 600 impoverished African American sharecroppers, 399 with syphilis and 201 without, many of whom had never even visited a doctor before. They were enticed by an offer of free medical care. However, the people behind the study intentionally refused to explain what exactly they were examining in the men that would unwittingly become the test subjects. Those participating in the Tuskegee experiment were falsely told that they were being treated for bad blood, a colloquial, non-specific term used in the area to describe a number of different ailments. The participants were given placebos such as aspirin and mineral supplements and then told this would treat their condition. However, some 15 years into the study in 1947, a treatment for syphilis was discovered in the form of penicillin. The Public Health Service neglected to tell these men the truth at any point, nor did they offer the widely available antibiotic, which had since become the standard treatment for syphilis. In fact, the researchers offered no medical care to these men as their condition progressed, even as some of them started to go blind, suffered other severe health problems, or even went insane due to syphilis. Over the course of the study, 28 participants passed away due to syphilis, and a further 100 died from complications linked to the disease. 40 of the participants' spouses were also diagnosed with it, and it had been passed on to almost 20 children. A year after the story broke and sparked public outrage, Congress held multiple hearings looking at the Tuskegee experiment. In 1974, the surviving participants of the unethical study, along with the families of those who had died, received a $10 million settlement, and new guidelines were put in place in order to protect human subjects. And that was totally the last time the US was ever involved in a sinister cover-up. Okay, we lied. That sentence in itself was a cover-up. Gotta earn those secretive US government checks somehow. Adding yet another US political scandal to the list, the Iran-Contra affair saw the United States National Security Council becoming involved in several secret arms deals without knowledge or approval of Congress. As a matter of fact, these transactions were outright banned by Congress and violated the government's own policies. Through the NSC, the U.S. traded missiles and other weapons to free American hostages in Lebanon, as well as channeling funds to support an armed conflict that was occurring in Nicaragua. The Iran-Contra affair was so controversial that it even threatened to topple the president of the U.S. at the time, Ronald Reagan. After Reagan, a Republican, took office, his political reach was limited by a Democrat majority in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. But one of his major political platforms had been to back the numerous anti-communist insurgencies that were operating around the globe, something that the Democrats wouldn't support. In fact, they actively brought up in legislation to limit the influence the CIA and the Department of Defense had on foreign conflicts. At the time, both Iran and Nicaragua had undergone significant changes to their regimes, with the former toppling their pro-Western government, replacing it with an anti-US Islamic fundamentalist one. Meanwhile, the latter was now under the control of the leftist Sandinista government, who Reagan and his administration feared would allow communism to spread into Central America. So, without the approval of Congress, Financial and military support was offered by the U.S. to the Contras, the counter-revolutionary forces that were attempting to overthrow Nicaragua's left-wing government. They attempted to pull off a similar strategy in Iran. However, things were complicated when the Iran hostage crisis took place, during which Iranian-backed Shiite terrorists took a number of American diplomats and private contractors hostage. In order to secure the release of the hostages, the NSC engaged in an arms deal with Iran, with plans to also channel the funds from that deal to the Contras in Nicaragua. These illegal arms trading activities were discovered in November 1986, when a plane that was carrying supplies to the Contras was shot down by the Sandinistas, and the pilot was taken prisoner. Naturally, a public uproar quickly followed in the U.S. once this was brought to light. But that is nowhere near as freaky as what went on in Operation Midnight Climax. While MKUltra's name lives in infamy, the codename of Operation Midnight Climax is often forgotten about. This was a sub-project of MKUltra, specifically its mind control research program that started in the 50s. The man in charge was one Sidney Gottlieb, a CIA chemist and spy master who was permitted to test lysergic acid diethylamide, commonly known as LSD, on civilians without their consent. Gottlieb was also that rogue CIA scientist we mentioned who stole all of the shellfish poison earlier. Yep, that'll be relevant later. Anyway, back to Midnight Climax. The CIA paid escorts to lure their clients to safe houses where they were then administered with a wide and dangerous array of substances without their knowledge and observed from behind one-way glass. The unwilling participants were then pressed to reveal personal secrets, fed subliminal messages to make them carry out actions involuntarily, including seeing whether under the influence of LSD they could be convinced to carry out assaults, robberies, and even assassinations. The goal was for the CIA to determine if brainwashing was possible and how to gain control over the minds of enemy spies. They also wanted to test whether LSD could be used during interrogations and combined the drug with intense isolation, dosing subjects and then keeping them confined and alone for months at a time, with hardly any food or water. Hundreds of federal agents and scientists took part in these unethical experiments on innocent people before Operation Midnight Climax and the rest of MKUltra was shut down in the 60s. But we know what you've all been waiting for, that deranged CIA secret weapon. Arguably, one of the most infamous and unusual findings of the Church Committee was the CIA's very own heart attack gun. This secret weapon wasn't just a concept either, it was very real and used in multiple assassinations. It worked by firing a small poison dart filled with frozen shellfish toxin. I wonder where they got that. And that would then trigger a heart attack in its target. The darts could easily pierce clothing and would be hardly felt by the target, leaving little more than a small red dot on the skin. The darts would completely disintegrate when entering the target's body, leaving little trace and allowing the poison to rapidly enter their bloodstream, causing a fatal heart attack. After death, the poison denatures quickly, meaning the detection in an autopsy is next to impossible, causing the death to be chalked up to completely natural causes. The existence of this almost fictitious-sounding weapon was revealed during the Church Committee's investigations and was verified by congressional testimony on the CIA's many rogue espionage activities. You can even find photos of Senator Church himself holding the infamous heart attack gun. If binge-watching Breaking Bad, Narcos, and The Wire has taught us anything, it's that drug smugglers are an eccentric bunch. Considering the drug trade turns over hundreds of billions of dollars a year and results in hundreds of thousands of deaths, it's bound to attract some huge weirdos with loony ideas and unscrupulous methods for stacking cash and racking up bodies. But as is the case with most things, reality is often far stranger than fiction. Here are some of the weirdest, most disturbing, and downright craziest ways that real-life drug smugglers have tried to hide their illegal products. Let's start with the most basic. And even that's both extremely dangerous and extremely disgusting. You might think a drug smuggler needs a bunch of complicated and high-tech equipment to ferry contraband across the borders. But in a lot of cases, all they need is a condom and an empty stomach. Practitioners of this method are known as swallowers, internal carriers, and body packers. They numb their throats to avoid discomfort, then swallow as many as 200 cocaine-filled condoms, each one carrying around 2 to 50 grams. If this is making people with sensitive gag reflexes nervous, don't worry. Body packers have been known to insert the drug capsules anally too. If the perpetrator makes it through customs without getting caught, they'll take laxatives to evacuate their extremely expensive cargo and then collect their paycheck. If things go badly, radiographers at customs will catch out the would-be smugglers and they'll face legal consequences. But there are far worse fates for body packers than an extended stay in jail. There are 35 countries that still have the death penalty for drug smugglers on the books, and some countries are still very actively pursuing those punishments, such as Singapore and China. But you can still face a terrible fate from body packing before you're even caught. Occasionally, the capsules will break inside the body packer's stomach, spiking their systems with a massive cocaine overdose. This is incredibly unpleasant, according to one Barcelona emergency room doctor who's dealt with a number of ODing body packers. A cocaine overdose can produce a psychotic episode and a nervous state that ambulance personnel will try to treat with injectable diazepam. If the drugs have spread throughout the body, one of the common effects is vasoconstriction, increased blood pressure caused by the constriction of blood vessels. Heart attacks and vasoconstriction are the most common causes of death in those cases. If we suspect that a patient has overdosed, we perform a barium X-ray. The barium also has a laxative effect. If we discover that it's indeed a severe overdose, we'll immediately have the drugs surgically removed from their system. Animal lovers might want to plug their ears for this next one, because human stomachs aren't the only ones used for drug smuggling. And sometimes the methods drug smugglers employ in this regard are outright monstrous. One Colombian heroin outfit smuggled liquid heroin in the stomachs of puppies in 2005. When the US DEA raided a farm operated by the cartel, they were able to rescue 10 purebred Labrador puppies, 6 of which had already had their stomachs cut open for the storage of 3 kilogram or 6.6 pound heroin packets. While the puppies were rescued, not all of them survived the harrowing ordeal. 3 of the 6 who'd been infused with the heroin packets died of infections after the drugs were removed. Smuggling drugs inside literal puppies would feel like the work of a silly cartoon supervillain if it wasn't so gut-wrenchingly horrifying in real life. But if that wasn't unholy enough for you, what about one crazy drug smuggler who thought literal holy water would be the best vector for his smuggling? This actually happened in 2008 when customs caught Warren Maynard, a 50-year-old New York man, trying to sneak dozens of bottles of ketamine-laced water that he claimed was holy water. Well, he wasn't technically right in that regard. A bottle of water mixed with a powerful hallucinogen certainly might make a person feel like they're a little closer to the Almighty. He wasn't even the only smuggler to use religion as a shield for his sinister activities. In March 2020, a Cincinnati Customs and Border Patrol team intercepted a collection of religious paintings that just so happened to contain 9.2 pounds of meth with a street value of $16,720. Is nothing sacred anymore? And because subtlety is dead, Bernardino Garcia Cordova, a drug trafficker also known as the Spider, imported a statue of Jesus that was literally made from $30,000 worth of cocaine. And this isn't just a classy ornament for drug lords who also happen to be devout Catholics. DEA spokesperson Stephen Robertson said, "The statue could have been broken down with water, sifted, and then strained to get the all-too-precious powder into street sale form." It's clear that if you want to be successful in this field of criminality, you gotta use your head. But there are right and wrong ways to use your head, as 2 British women aged 17 and 20 found out when they engaged in a harebrained scheme to smuggle $220,000 worth of cocaine stitched to wigs. They were apparently paid only £4,000 to be the mules in this scheme, which probably wasn't worth the risk, or the many years in prison they were likely handed after being caught by the Jamaican authorities and sent back to the UK. This seems to be a pretty embarrassing way to go down. But at least those 2 anonymous British drug mules aren't alone. In 2011, a 12-person drug ring was arrested in Philadelphia for a more complex but still equally stupid scheme. They were smuggling drugs out of Panama by sewing the drug packets into wigs and weaves before accepting the packages in the US and passing the drugs over to street-level dealers in not 1, not 2, but 3 different states. Of all the flaws in their plan, a lack of ambition was not one of them. Sometimes it isn't the quantity of drugs smuggled that surprises you, but the location. Fellas, we warn ya, this one, it's gonna make you squirm. 2 different men, Antoine Banks in 2011 and later Joshua Hare in 2016, were both arrested for hiding tiny drug packets under their foreskins. We here at the Infographics Show are not entirely sure that any kind of payment would be worth going through that particular ordeal. Let's get away from that nightmare as soon as possible and instead talk about horses. Don't worry, equestrians, we're not going to tell you anyone's cutting open horses. Well, not yet anyway. In this 2017 story of a deranged drug distribution, Customs seized $1.2 million worth of liquid meth that an enterprising 31-year-old woman had hidden in horse shampoo bottles. Do we think this is a good idea? Nay. Was that too corny? Sorry, we'll show ourselves out through the stable. If all this has left you all feeling a little disturbed, please take a second to rest. How about a snack? Maybe some sweet, delicious strawberry jam. Just make sure that the jam didn't come from this particular shipment of jam that was intercepted by Customs and Border Patrol back in Arizona in 2016. A 51-year-old trucker was caught with 6,500 pounds of contraband marijuana, valued at $3.25 million, hidden inside vats of strawberry jam. Yummy! Food products can be a common vector for drug smuggling. In January 2017, a Southern Border Patrol bust revealed huge quantities of cocaine hidden in cans of tuna and corn. In Melbourne, Australia, customs agents found 5 tons of ecstasy hidden in tins disguised as canned tomatoes. But even the fruits and vegetables themselves aren't safe. The infamous Sinaloa drug cartel has been known to stuff plantains, cucumbers, and coconuts with drugs. The same can be said of burritos, chili peppers, fake carrots, soda cans, candy, yams, and extremely unconvincing packs of limes, which were actually just printed photos of limes wrapped around larger bricks of marijuana with a street value of $500,000. Believe us, this is a lot more appealing than the Texas drug smugglers who hid $459,000 worth of cocaine and marijuana in barrels of grease. Talk about slipping customs. A similarly unappealing smuggling scheme unfolded in Thailand, where a popular variation of methamphetamine known as yaba, translated literally to crazy drug, has taken the scene by storm. One of the weirdest ways of smuggling yaba has been hiding it in the bodies of dead bugs. Though personally we find ferrying around shipments of dead bugs pretty weird and suspicious in its own right. Don't you agree? You'd think it's too risky or too obvious to smuggle drugs inside a car, but professional drug smugglers still find bizarre and novel ways to do it. One bust in early 2017 found a record-breaking $2 million worth of methamphetamine in packs under the dashboard of a Volkswagen Jetta. A white sedan also had $1.3 million of cocaine stashed in a secret compartment hidden behind the license plate. And who could forget the pickup truck that hid $800,000 worth of marijuana in a secret compartment beneath its flatbed? And hey, just in case you were worried that there was literally any part of a vehicle that a drug smuggler couldn't turn into a hiding place, a smuggler at the Presidio border hid $500,000 in meth above the gas tank of a 1999 Mercedes-Benz. And now we understand the true secret of being able to afford a Mercedes-Benz. Wow! But not every drug smuggler about town is willing to settle for something that mundane. Some drug lords truly want to live up to their Bond villain media image. One way of doing that is by investing in a 6-man drug smuggling submarine, or drug marine, if you will. The submarine, powered by diesel and seized in Ecuador in 2010, was designed to carry over 10 metric tons of drugs. And while it may have been intercepted and caught in the end, nobody could deny it is incredibly theatrical. But what if you want to go old school? We're talking World War I old school. In Colombia, there have been documented cases of carrier pigeons being used to transport small pouches of marijuana and crack, like sending wartime messages but far more illegal. How about we go even older school? This time we're talking about medieval old school. Catapults and trebuchets are siege weapons used for taking down castles, but drug cartels have found a new purpose for them, flinging marijuana buds across the border so they can start their own free-range weed farms in the US. It's forced border agents to keep an eye on the land around the fence for any suspicious seedlings. Some people don't care for the classics though, they just want to keep it cutting edge. Such as one anonymous drug smuggler who used a drone to smuggle 13 pounds of meth across the border between San Diego and Tijuana, Mexico. Border Patrol intercepted the drone pretty easily and arrested the smuggler, who would later be sentenced to 12 years in prison for his trouble. Perhaps it's better to stick to the classics and invest in a sturdy, reliable trebuchet instead. It still somehow gets crazier from here though. You may remember such meme movies as the 2006 Samuel L. Jackson classic Snakes on a Plane, and the 2023 Elizabeth Banks classic Cocaine Bear. But what if their powers combined into Snakes on a Plane on Cocaine? Except this isn't a movie, it was real, and it happened in 1993 when 80 pounds of cocaine was forced into the bellies of 223 live snakes by drug smugglers. Crazy antics ensued. The snakes somehow escaped, causing chaos throughout the plane, until one quick-thinking cop escorting an important witness to the stand was able to take control of the situation and scene. Snakes on a Plane on Cocaine, coming to your local cinemas next fall. Unfortunately, the reality didn't follow our little movie script. The snakes actually all died from the trauma, much like the bear that inspired Cocaine Bear. But to a drug smuggler, sometimes a dead animal can be just as useful as a live one. The Mexico City drug cartel split a ton of cocaine between 20 dead sharks, which they then tried to sneak into the United States. Much like the dead bugs full of yaba back in Thailand, we can't help but wonder if hiding cocaine in a bizarre shipment of 20 dead sharks might just draw too much unwanted attention to your secret cargo. But hey, we just make infotainment videos on YouTube. Who are we to tell El Chapo how to do his job? Just please don't send any sicarios our way, okay? On the less ambitious side of things, in 2007, some small-time New Zealand criminals tried to get drugs to their incarcerated friends by shoving the drugs into dead birds and throwing them over the prison walls. In 2001, a man named Richard Reed made going to the airport harder for all of us when he tried and failed to detonate a bomb inside his shoe while on an airplane. But it wasn't just Mr. Reed's fault. The TSA soon got another reason to check your smelly sneakers. A man was busted at JFK in New York for allegedly trying to smuggle cocaine in his shoes. He had 4 pounds of cocaine hidden between 6 pairs of shoes in his luggage. He was hoping to make $67,000 on this contraband, and instead all he got was federal narcotics charges from Homeland Security. High risk, no reward. A northern Spanish gang of drug traffickers took shoe-smuggled drugs to a whole new level by also throwing counterfeiting on top. They created high-quality knockoffs of Manolo Blahnik stiletto shoes, held together with cocaine paste. Each pair of shoes sold for $75,000, which for those keeping track is more than the previous guy at JFK Airport stood to gain from all 6 of his life-ruining cocaine shoes. In 2018, Portuguese airport security couldn't help but notice an unusually caked-up Brazilian man strolling through Lisbon International Airport. Nobody will ever know what was going through their heads when they pulled that man aside and asked him to drop his trousers and bare his buttocks. But in that moment, they uncovered a drug smuggler. He was hiding a kilogram of cocaine inside a pair of fake butt cheeks. That's a badonkadon't. But sometimes smugglers go even further than that, such as a Colombian woman arrested in Germany in 2016, whom customs noticed had fresh scars beneath her breasts. This turned out to be because she was hiding a kilogram of cocaine inside her breast implants. I guess you could say we saved the breast for last. Now watch what happens to your body when smoking weed, or check out Devil's Breath, World's Scariest Drug.